Things, A Story of the Sixties by Georges Perec. I wanted to read this book because I recently read Perfection by Vincenzo Latronico, which is a transposition of this book onto modern Berlin. Perfection is very much like Things, but a step back from reality. Instead of, like in Things, trying to achieve status and happiness by accumulating things, the couple in Perfection tries to imitate the perfection that they see on the internet by accumulating these objects. Personally, I preferred this version over Perfection because of the prose and its sharpness. However, I found the objects that define the couple's life in Perfection more recognizable and relatable than in Things. But maybe if you lived through the 60s, you might find the opposite. If you enjoy this book for its message, I would recommend reading Perfection by Vincenzo Latronico. And if you enjoyed Perec's prose and long tangential descriptions of rooms, I'd really recommend another book by him called Life, a User's Manual. I read it earlier this year and I found it really funny and genius. I hope you enjoy. 1. Your eye, first of all, would glide over the gray-fitted carpet in the narrow, long, and high-ceilinged corridor. Its walls would be cupboards in light-colored wood with fittings of gleaming brass. 3 prints depicting, respectively, the Derby winner Thunderbird, a paddle steamer named Vie de Motitero, and a Stephenson locomotive would lead to a leather curtain hanging on thick, black, grainy wooden rings which would slide back at the merest touch. There, the carpet would give way to an almost yellow woodblock floor, partly covered by 3 faded rugs. It would be a living room about 23 feet long by 10 feet wide. On the left, in a kind of recess, there would be a large sofa upholstered in worn black leather, with pale cherry wood bookcases on either side, heaped with books in untidy piles. Above the sofa, a mariner's chart would fill the whole length of that section of the wall. On the other side of a small low table, and beneath a silk prayer mat nailed to the wall with 3 large-headed brass studs, matching the leather curtain, there would be another sofa, at right angles to the first, with a light brown velvet covering. It would lead on to a small and spindly piece of furniture, lacquered in dark red and providing 3 display shelves for knickknacks. Agates and stone eggs, snuff boxes, candy boxes, jade ashtrays, a mother-of-pearl oyster shell, a silver fob watch, a cut glass, a crystal pyramid, a miniature in an oval frame. Further on, beyond a padded door, there would be shelving on both sides of the corner, for caskets and for records, beside a closed gramophone of which only 4 machine steel knobs would be visible, and above it a print depicting the Great Parade of the Military Tattoo. Through the window, draped with white and brown curtains in cloth imitating Joy wallpaper, you would glimpse a few trees, a tiny park, a bit of street. A roll-top desk littered with papers and pen holders would go with a small cane-seated chair. On a console table would be a telephone, a leather diary, a writing pad. Then, on the other side of another door, beyond a low, square, revolving bookcase supporting a large, cylindrical vase decorated in blue and filled with yellow roses, set beneath an oblong mirror in a mahogany frame, there would be a narrow table with its 2 benches upholstered in tartan, which would bring your eye back to the leather curtain. It would be all in browns, ochres, duns, and yellows, a world of slightly dull colors, and carefully graded shades, calculated with almost too much artistry, in the midst of which would be some striking, brighter splashes. A cushion in almost garish orange, a few multicolored book jackets amongst the leather-bound volumes. During the day, the light flooding in would make this room seem a little sad, despite the roses. It would be an evening room, but in the winter, with the curtains drawn, some spots illuminated: the bookcase corner, the record shelves, the desk, the low table between the 2 settees, and the vague reflections in the mirror, and large expanses in shadow whence all the things would gleam, the polished wood, the rich, heavy silks, the cut glass, the softened leather. It would be a haven of peace, a land of happiness. The first door would open onto a bedroom, its floor covered with a light-colored fitted carpet. An English double bed would fill the whole rear part of it. On the right, to both sides of the window, there would be tall and narrow sets of shelves holding a few books, to be read and read again, photograph albums, packs of cards, pots, necklaces, paste jewelry. To the left, an old oak wardrobe and 2 clothes horses of wood and brass would stand opposite a small wing chair upholstered in thin striped gray silk and a dressing table. Through a half-open door giving onto a bathroom, you would glimpse thick bathrobes, swan-neck taps and solid brass, a large adjustable mirror, a pair of cutthroat razors and their green leather sheaths, bottles, horn-handled brushes, sponges. The bedroom walls would be papered with chintz. The bedspread would be a tartan blanket. A bedside table with an open-work copper band running round 3 of its sides would support a silver candlestick lamp topped with a very pale grey silk shade, a square carriage clock, a rose in a stem vase, and, on its lower shelf, folded newspapers and some magazines. Further on, at the foot of the bed, there would be a big pouf in natural hide. At the window, the gauze curtains would slide on brass rods. The thick woolen double curtains would be half drawn. In the half-light, the room would still be bright. On the wall, above the bed made up and turned down for the night, between 2 small wall lamps, the astonishing, long, narrow, black and white photograph of a bird in the sky would surprise you by its slightly formal perfection. The second door would reveal a study. From top to bottom, the walls would be lined with books and periodicals, with, here and there, so as to break the continuity of bindings and jackets, a number of prints, drawings and photographs. Antonello de Messina's St. Jerome, a detail from the Triumph of St. George, one of Piranesi's dungeons, a portrait by Ingres, a little pen and ink landscape by Klee, a sepia-tint photograph of Renan in his room at the Collège de France, a Steinberg department store, Cranock's Melanchthon, pinned to wooden panels set into the shelving. Slightly to the left of the window and at a shallow angle would be a long country table covered with a large red blotter. Wooden boxes, flat pen holders and pots of all kinds would hold pencils, paper clips, staples large and small. A glass tile would serve as an ashtray. A circular black leather box decorated with gold leaf arabesques would be filled with cigarettes. Light would come from an old desk lamp, adjustable only with difficulty, fitted with a green opaline lampshade shaped like a visor. On each side of the table, virtually facing each other, would be 2 high-backed wood and leather armchairs. Still further to the left, along the wall, would be a narrow table overflowing with books. A wing chair in bottle green leather would lead to gray metal filing cabinets and light wooden card index boxes. On a third, even smaller table would be a Swedish lamp with a typewriter under its canvas dust cover. Right at the back would be a narrow bed covered in ultramarine velvet and stacked with cushions of all colors. On a painted wooden stand, almost in the middle of the room, there would be a globe made of papier-mâché and nickel silver, illustrated in naïve style, a fake antique. Behind the desk, half hidden by the red curtain at the window, would be an oiled wood ladder which would slide on a brass rail all the way round the room. There, life would be easy, simple. All the servitudes, all the problems brought by material existence would find a natural solution. A cleaning lady would come every morning. Every fortnight, wine, oil, and sugar would be delivered. There would be a huge, bright kitchen with blue tiles decorated with heraldic emblems, 3 china plates decorated with yellow arabesques and metallic paint, cupboards everywhere. a handsome whitewood table in the middle with stools and bench seats. It would be pleasant to come and sit there every morning after a shower, scarcely dressed. On the table there would be a sizable stoneware butter dish, jars of marmalade, honey, toast, grapefruit cut in two. It would be early. It would be May, the start of a long summer's day. They would open the mail, they would open the newspapers, they would light their first cigarette, they would go out. Their work would keep them busy for a few hours only, in the morning. They would meet for lunch, a sandwich or a steak according to their mood. They would have coffee at a street cafe and then go home, on foot, slowly. Their flat would rarely be tidy, but its very untidiness would be its greatest charm. They would hardly bother themselves with it. They would live in it. The comfort of their surroundings would seem to them to be an established fact, a datum, a state of their nature. Their attention would be elsewhere, on the book they would open, on the text they would draft, on the record they would listen to, on their dialogue engaged afresh each day. They would work for a long while, then they would dine or go out for dinner, they would see old friends, they would walk together. Sometimes it would seem to them that a whole life could be led harmoniously between these book-lined walls, amongst these objects so perfectly domesticated that they would have ended up believing these bright, soft, simple, and beautiful things had only ever been made for their sole use. But they wouldn't feel enslaved by them. On some days they would go off on a chance adventure. No plan seemed impossible to them. They would not know rancor or bitterness or envy, for their means and their desires would always match in all ways. They would call this balance happiness, and, with their freedom, with their wisdom and their culture, they would know how to retain and to reveal in it every moment of their living, together. Two. They would have liked to be rich. They believed they would have been up to it. They would have known how to dress, how to look, and how to smile like rich people. They would have had the requisite tact and discretion. They would have forgotten they were rich, would have grasped how not to flaunt their wealth. They wouldn't have taken pride in it. They would have drunk it into themselves. Their pleasures would have been intense. They would have liked to wander, to dawdle, to choose, to savor. They would have liked to live. Their lives would have been an art of living. But such things are far from easy. For this young couple, who were not rich but wanted to be, simply because they were not poor, there could be no situation more awkward. They had only what they deserved to have. They were thrown, when already they were dreaming of space, light, silence, back to the reality, which was not even miserable, but simply cramped, and that was perhaps even worse, of their tiny flat, of their everyday meals, of their puny holidays. That was what corresponded to their economic status, to their social situation. That was their reality, and they had no other. But beside them, all around them, all along the streets where they could not but walk, existed the fallacious but nonetheless glowing offerings of antique dealers, delicatessens, and stationers. From Palais Royal to Saint-Germain-des-Prés, from Champs de Mars to the Champs-Élysées, from the Luxembourg Gardens to Montparnasse, from Ile Saint-Louis to the Marais, from Place de Tournes to Place de l'Opéra, from Madeleine to the Monceau Gardens, to the whole of Paris was a perpetual temptation. They burned with desire to give in to it, passionately, straight away and forever. But the horizon of their desires was mercilessly blocked. Their great impossible dreams belonged only to Utopia. They lived in a quaint, low-ceilinged and tiny flat overlooking a garden, and as they remembered their garret, a gloomy, narrow, overheated corridor with clinging smells, they lived in their flat, to begin with, in a kind of intoxication, refreshed each morning by the sound of chirping birds. They would open the windows, and for many minutes they would gaze in utter happiness at their courtyard. The building was old, not yet at all to the point of collapse, but dowdy and cracked. The corridors and staircases were narrow and dirty, dripping with damp, impregnated with greasy fumes. But in between 2 large trees and 5 tiny garden plots of irregular shapes, most of them overgrown but endowed with precious lawn, flowers in pots, bushes, even primitive statues, there wound a path made of rough, large paving stones which gave the whole thing a countryside air. It was one of those rare spots in Paris where it could happen, on some autumn days after rain, that a smell would rise from the ground, an almost powerful smell of the forest, of earth, of rotting leaves. They never tired of these charms, and they always remained just as naturally responsive to them as they had been on the first day. But it became obvious, after a few carefree, jaunty months, that these attractions could in no way suffice to make them oblivious to the inadequacies of their dwelling. Accustomed to living in squalid rooms where all they did was to sleep, and to spending their days in cafes, they took a long time to notice that the most banal functions of everyday life, sleeping, eating, reading, chatting, washing, each required a specific space, the manifest absence of which then began to make itself felt. They found consolation where they could, congratulated themselves on the excellent neighborhood they were in, on the proximity of Rue Mouffetard and the Jardin des Plantes, on the quietness of the street, on the stylishness of their low ceilings, and on the magnificence of the trees and the courtyard through all the seasons. But indoors it all began to collapse under the heaps of objects, of furniture, books, plates, papers, empty bottles. A war of attrition began from which they could never emerge victorious. With a total floor area of 35 square meters, which they never dared check, their flat consisted of a minute entrance hall, a cramped kitchen, half of which had been converted into a washroom, a modest-sized bedroom, an all-purpose room, library, living room or study, spare bedroom, and an ill-defined nook, halfway between a broom cupboard and a corridor, in which space had somehow been found for a matchbox fridge, an electric water heater, an improvised wardrobe, a table, at which they ate, and a laundry box which doubled up as a bench seat. On some days the lack of space became overwhelming. They would suffocate, but it was no use pushing back the boundaries of their 2-roomed flatlet, no use knocking down walls, calling up corridors, cupboards, openings, no use imagining ideal wardrobes or taking over adjacent flats in their dreams. They would always end up back in what was their lot, their only lot, 35 square meters. Judicious improvements would undoubtedly have been feasible. A partition wall could have been removed, freeing a huge and ill-used corner space. A too bulky piece of furniture could be replaced advantageously. A set of cupboards could spring up. Doubtless, then, provided it was repainted, stripped, done up with a little love, their dwelling would have been unquestionably charming, with its one red-curtained window and its other window with green curtains, with its long, rather wobbly oak table that had been bought at the flea market, filling the whole length of one wall section, beneath the very fine reproduction of a mariner's chart, in which a little roll-top Second Empire escritoire made of mahogany with inlaid brass beads, several missing, separated into 2 working desks. To the left for Sylvie, to the right for Jérôme, each signaled by an identical red blotter, an identical glass tile, an identical pencil box, with its old pewter-rimmed glass jar that had been transformed into a lamp, with its metal-reinforced wood veneer seed-measuring jar which did as a waste-paper basket, with its 2 unmatched armchairs, its rush-seated chairs, its milking stool. And the neat, clean, and ingenious whole would emanate friendliness and warmth, a wholesome aura of work and shared living. But the mere prospect of the work involved scared them. They would have had to borrow, to save, to invest. They could not bring themselves to do it. Their hearts weren't in it. They thought only in terms of all or nothing. The bookcase would be light oak or it would not be. It was not. The books piled up on 2 dirty wooden shelving stacks, and, in double rows, in cupboards which should never have been used that way. For 3 years an electric point remained unrepaired, without their making up their minds to call in an electrician, whilst along almost every wall ran crudely spliced and shoddily extended leads. It took them 6 months to replace a curtain pulley rope, and the slightest hold-up in regular maintenance resulted within 24 hours in a mess which the beneficent presence of trees and gardens so close at hand made even more unbearable. The temporary, the provisional, held absolute sway. They were in wait only of a miracle. They would have summoned architects, contractors, builders, plumbers, decorators, and painters. They would have gone on a cruise, and on their return would have found a flat transformed, converted, refurbished, a model apartment, miraculously enlarged, full of custom-built details, removable partitions, sliding doors, an efficient and unobtrusive heating system, invisible electric wiring, good quality furniture. But between these two grand daydreams in which they wallowed with strange self-indulgence, and their total lack of any actual doing, no rational plan, matching the objective necessities to their financial means, arose to fill the gap. The vastness of their desires paralyzed them. Such a lack of directness, of clear-headedness almost, was typical. What was probably the most serious thing was that they were cruelly lacking in ease. Not material, objective ease, but easiness, or a certain kind of relaxedness. They tended to be on edge, tense, avid, almost jealous. Their love of well-being, of higher living standards, came out most often as an idiotic kind of sermonizing, when they would hold forth, they and their friends, on the sheer genius of a pipe or a low table. They would turn them into objets d'art, into museum pieces. They would become passionate about a suitcase, one of those tiny, astonishingly flat cases in slightly grainy black leather you could see on display in a shop window around Madeleine, and which seemed the quintessence of the alleged pleasures of lightning visits to New York or to London. They would cross all of Paris to see an armchair they'd been told was just perfect. And since they knew their classics, they would sometimes even hesitate to put on some new garment, as it would seem so important to them, for it to look its best, that it should first have been worn 3 times. But the slightly ritualized gestures they would make to show their approval at a tailor's or a milliner's or a bootmaker's shop window display only managed, most often, to make them look slightly silly. Perhaps they were too marked by their past, not they alone, moreover, but their friends, their colleagues, people of their age, the circles they mixed in. Perhaps they were too greedy from the outset. They wanted to go too fast. The world and its things would have had to have always belonged to them, and then they could have imprinted on them myriad signs of their ownership. But they were condemned to conquest. They could become richer and richer, but there was no way they could have always been rich. They would have liked to live in comfort, amidst beauty. But they shrieked, they admired, and that was the surest proof that they were not in it, not amidst it. They lacked tradition, in perhaps the most despicable sense of the word, as well as true enjoyment, implicit and imminent, like a self-evident truth, the enjoyment which involves bodily happiness. Their pleasure was cerebral. Too often, what they liked in the things they called luxury was only the money behind them. They loved wealth before they loved life. In this respect, their first sallies outside the student world, their first forays into the universe of high-class shops which was soon to become their promised land, were particularly revealing. Their still wavering taste, their over-hesitant meticulousness, their lack of experience, their rather blinkered respect for what they believed to be the standards of true good taste, brought them some jarring moments, some humiliations. For a time it might have appeared that this sartorial ideal to which J. Rome and his friends inspired was not that of the English gentleman, but the utterly continental caricature of it presented by a recent emigrant on a modest salary. And on the day Jérôme bought his first pair of British shoes, he took great care, after polishing them at length with a woolen rag dipped in a little beeswax of superior quality, rubbing very gently in small concentric circles. He took great care to put them in the sun, where they were supposed to acquire an outstanding shine in the least time. Alas, alongside a pair of crepe-soled moccasin ankle boots, which he obstinately refused to wear, they were his only shoes. He misused them, dragged them through rutted tracks, and finished them off in just under 7 months. Then, as time passed, with the help of accumulating experience, it seemed that they were learning how to stand back a little from their most fervent passions. They had learned how to wait, and how to grow accustomed. Their taste matured slowly, became firmer, more balanced. Their desires had time to ripen. Their greed became less sour. When on outings around Paris they stopped in villages to look at antiques, they no longer rushed straight towards the china plates, towards the church pews, towards the blown glass demijohns and the brass candlesticks. To be sure, the somewhat static image they had of the ideal home, of perfect amenity, of the happy life was still imbued with a lot of naivety, a lot of self-indulgence. There was something forced in their liking for objects which only the taste of the day decreed to be beautiful. Imitation Épinal pseudo-naive cartoons, English-style etchings, agates, spun-glass tumblers, neo-primitive paste jewelry, para-scientific apparatus, which in no time at all they would come across in all the window displays in Rue Jacob, in Rue Visconti. They still dreamt of possessing such things. They would have assuaged that obvious, instant need to be up to date, to be seen to be connoisseurs. But this extreme imitativeness was becoming less and less important, and it was pleasant for them to reflect the picture they had of life was slowly being stripped of all its more aggressive, showy, and occasionally juvenile trappings. They had burnt what they had previously worshipped, the witches' mirrors, the chopping blocks, those stupid little mobiles, the radiometers, the multicolored pebbles, the Hessian panels adorned with expressive squiggles as if by Mathieu. It seemed to them that they were progressively mastering their desires. They knew what they wanted, they had clear ideas. They knew what their happiness, their freedom would be. But they were wrong all the same. They were beginning to lose their way. Already they were starting to feel they were being propelled along a path of which they knew neither the turns nor the terminus. They did on occasions feel frightened. Most often, however, all they felt was impatience. They felt ready. They were available. They were waiting to live. They were waiting for money. III. Jérôme was 24 and Sylvie 22. They were both market researchers. Their work, which was not exactly a trade nor quite a profession, consisted of interviewing people by various different techniques, on a range of subjects. It was difficult work, requiring at the very least a high degree of nervous concentration, but it was not uninteresting, not at all badly paid, and it left them an appreciable amount of free time. Like almost all their colleagues, Jérôme and Sylvie had become market researchers by necessity and not by choice. No one knows, in any case, where the untrammeled development of their natural inclinations towards idleness would have led them. There again, history had chosen for them. Of course, like everyone else, they would have liked to give themselves to something, to feel in themselves some powerful need that they would have called a vocation, an ambition that would have raised them up, a passion that would have fulfilled them. But they possessed, alas, but a single passion, the passion for a higher standard of living, and it exhausted them. When they were students, the prospect of a mediocre degree and then a teaching post with a tiny salary at Nogent-sur-Seine, Château Thierry, or Étampes terrified them so much that virtually on meeting each other, Jérôme was then 21, Sylvie 19, and without needing to talk it over, they dropped out of courses they had never really begun. The thirst for knowledge did not torture them. Far more prosaically, and without hiding from the fact that they were probably making a mistake, and that sooner or later they would come to regret it, they thirsted for a slightly bigger room, for running hot and cold water, for a shower, for meals more varied, or just more copious, than those they ate in student canteens, maybe for a car, for records, holidays, clothes. Motivation research had emerged in France several years earlier. That year it was still expanding fast. New agencies were springing up by the month, out of nothing, or almost. You could get work in them easily. Most often it involved going into parks or standing at school gates or knocking on doors in suburban housing estates to ask housewives if they had noticed some recent advertisement and what they thought of it. These instant surveys, called mini-tests or quickies, earned 100 francs each. It wasn't much, but it was better than babysitting, working as a night watchman or as a dishwasher, better than any of the other menial jobs, distributing leaflets, bookkeeping, timing radio advertisements, hawking, cramming, which were traditionally the preserve of students. And then the very youth of the agencies themselves, their almost informal state of development, the still total absence of trained staff, held out the prospect, at least potentially, of rapid promotion and a dizzying rise in status. It was not a bad guess. They spent a few months handing out survey questionnaires. Then came an agency director, who, for lack of time, took a chance on them, and so they set off for the provinces with tape recorders under their arms. Some of their fellow travelers, scarcely older than they were, introduced them to the techniques of the open and the closed interview, which were actually less difficult than is commonly supposed. They learned how to make other people do the talking and to weigh their own words carefully. They learned how to unearth from people's muddled hesitations, perplexed silences, and shy hints the lines that needed pursuing. They pierced the secret of that universal aha, a truly magical intonation with which the interviewer punctuates the interviewee's words, to bolster his confidence, to show that he understands, to egg him on, to query, and even sometimes to threaten him. They obtained respectable results. They built on their success. They picked up, from here and from there, snippets of sociology, psychology, statistics. They acquired the vocabulary and the signs, the mannerisms that make the right impression. For Sylvie, a particular way of putting on and taking off her glasses, a particular way of taking notes, of thumbing through a report, a particular way of speaking, of inserting in her conversations with employers in a barely interrogative tone of voice, turns of phrase like indeed, I guess maybe, up to a point. What I'm wondering is, a particular way of quoting at appropriate points the names of C. Wright Mills, William White, or, even better, Lazarsfeld, Cantrill, or Herbert Hyman, of whose works they had read not 3 pages. They proved very adept at acquiring these indispensable basic items of professional equipment, and scarcely 1 year after their first involvement in motivation research, they were entrusted with the highly responsible task of a content analysis. It was one rung only below the role of project supervisor, which was always performed by an office-based executive, the highest, thus the best paid and consequently the most prestigious position in the whole hierarchy. Over the following years, they almost never slipped from these heights. And so for 4 years, and maybe more, they explored and interviewed and analyzed. Why are pure suction vacuum cleaners selling so poorly? What do people of modest origin think of chicory? Do you like ready-made mashed potato? And if so, why? Because it's light? Because it's creamy? Because it's easy to make? Just open it up and there you are? Do people really reckon baby carriages are expensive? Aren't you always prepared to fork out a bit extra for the good of the kids? Which way will French women vote? Do people like cheese in squeezy tubes? Are you for or against public transport? What do you notice first when you eat yogurt? The color, the texture, the taste, the natural odor? Do you read a lot, a little, not at all? Do you eat out? Would you, madam, like to rent your room to a black? What do people think, honestly, of old age pensions? What does the youngster generation think? What do executives think? What does the woman of 30 think? What do you think of holidays? Where do you spend your holidays? Do you like frozen food? How much do you think a lighter like this one costs, eh? What do you look for in a mattress? Describe a man who likes pasta. What do you think of your washing machine? Are you satisfied with it? Doesn't it make too many suds? Does it wash properly? Does it tear the clothes? Does it dry? Would you rather have a washing machine that dries well? And safety in coal mines, is it all right or no good enough in your view, sir? Make the target speak. Ask him to give personal examples, things he has seen. Has he been injured himself? How did it happen? And your son, sir, will he be a miner like his father? So what will he be then? There was washing, drying, ironing, gas, electricity, and the telephone. Children, clothes and underclothes, mustard, packet soups, tinned soups, hair, how to wash it, how to dry it, how to make it hold wave, how to make it shine. Students, fingernails, cough syrup, typewriters, fertilizers, tractors, leisure pursuits, presents, stationery, linen, politics, motorways, alcoholic drinks, mineral water, cheeses, jams, lamps and curtains, insurance and gardening. Nil humani alienum. Nothing that was human was outside their scope. For the first time they earned some money. They did not like their work. Could they have liked it? But they did not dislike it a great deal either. They felt they were learning a lot from it. Year after year it changed them completely. These were their great days of conquest. They had nothing. They were discovering the riches of the world. For years they had been absolutely anonymous. They dressed like students, that is to say badly. Sylvie had a single shirt, ugly jumpers, a pair of cord trousers, a duffel coat. Jérôme had a mucky parka, an off-the-peg suit, one pitiful necktie. They leapt ecstatically into fashionable English clothes. They discovered knitwear, silk blouses, shirts by Doucet, cotton voile ties, silk scarves, tweed, lamb's wool, cashmere, vicuña, leather and jersey wool, flax, and, finally, the great staircase of footwear leading from churches to Westons, from Westons to Buntings, and from Buntings to Lobs. Their dream was a trip to London. They would have split their time between the National Gallery, Savile Row, and a particular pub in Church Street, which had stuck with feeling in Jérôme's memory. But they were not yet rich enough to kit themselves out from top to toe in London. In Paris, the first money gaily earned by the sweat of their brows, Sylvie spent on shopping. A knitted silk bodice from Coronel, an imported lambswool twin set, a straight formal skirt, extremely soft plated leather shoes, and a big silk headscarf with a peacock and foliage pattern. Jérôme, for his part, though he was still fond of shuffling around from time to time in clogs, unshaven, wearing an old collarless shirt and some denim trousers, went in for total contrasts and discovered the joys of lazy mornings, taking a bath, shaving very close, sprinkling eau de toilette, slipping on over still damp skin a shirt of unimpeachable whiteness, tying a woolen or silken necktie. He bought 3 of these at Old England, together with a tweed jacket, some marked-down shirts, and a pair of shoes he thought he would not be embarrassed to wear. Then, and this was one of the important days of their lives, they came across the flea market. Splendid, long-collared, button-down Arrow and Van Heusen shirts, at that time unfindable in Paris shops, but which American comedy films were making increasingly popular, at least for that marginal set of people who delight in American comedies, were to be found there in untidy heaps, alongside allegedly indestructible trench coats, skirts, blouses, silk dresses, hide jackets, and soft leather moccasins. They went every fortnight, on Saturday mornings, for a year or more, to rummage through tea chests, display stalls, stacks, boxes, upturned umbrellas, amongst crowds of teenagers with long sideburns, Algerian watch peddlers and American tourists who emerged from the glass eyes, shiny top hats, and hobby horses of the Vernasian market, and wandered in a state of mild bewilderment around the Malik market, pondering on the strange fate of things, laid out alongside used nails, second-hand mattresses, machines of which only the casing remained, and spare parts, things which were but the slightly imperfect surplus stock of America's most celebrated shirt-makers. And they would bring back all kinds of clothes wrapped in newspaper, trinkets, umbrellas, old pots, satchels, records. They were changing, becoming other people. It wasn't so much because of their, nonetheless genuine, need to differentiate themselves from the people it was their job to interview, to impress without overwhelming them. Nor was it because they met a lot of people, because they were taking their leave, forever, or so they thought, from what had been their milieu. But money, and this point cannot but be an obvious one, creates needs. They would have been surprised to realize, if they had thought about it for a moment. But in those years they didn't think. To what extent their views of their own bodies had altered, and, beyond that, their vision of everything that affected them, of everything that mattered, of everything that was in the process of becoming their world. Everything was new. Their sensibilities, their tastes, and their position propelled them towards things they had never known. They paid attention to the way others dressed. They noticed the furniture, the knickknacks, and the ties displayed in shop windows. They mused on estate agents' advertisements. They felt as if they understood things they had never bothered about before. It had come to matter to them whether a neighborhood or a street was sad or jolly, quiet or noisy, deserted or lively. Nothing, ever, had equipped them for such new concerns. They discovered them enthusiastically, with a kind of freshness, and were bemused by having spent so long in ignorance. They felt no surprise, or almost none, at the fact that they thought about almost nothing else. The paths they were following, the values they were gradually adopting, their outlook, their desires, and their ambitions, it must be said, did indeed sometimes all feel desperately empty. They knew nothing that was not precarious or puzzling. Yet this was their life. It was the source of unexpected experiences elating beyond intoxication. It was something hugely, intensely open. Sometimes they thought that the lives they would lead would be as magical, as flexible, as whimsical as American comedy films or title sequences by Saul Bass. And miraculous, luminous visions of pristine, snow-covered fields crossed by lines of ski tracks, of blue seas, sun, verdant hills, of logs crackling in stone hearths, of spectacular motorways, of Pullmans and palatial hotels caressed them, as if they were promises. They gave up their room in student canteens, just next to the Jardin des Plantes, opposite the Paris Mosque, at 7, Rue de Quatrefages. They found a little 2-roomed flat to rent, giving onto a pretty courtyard garden. They wanted carpets, tables, armchairs, sofas. Those were the years when they wandered endlessly around Paris. They would stop at every antique dealer's. They would go into department stores and stay for hours on end, marveling and already scared, but not daring to admit it to themselves, not daring to face squarely that particular type of despicable veracity which was to become their fate, their raison d'être, their watchword, for they were still marveling at and almost drowning under the scale of their own needs, of the riches laid out before them, of the abundance on offer. They discovered the smart little restaurants near Gobelins, Turns, Saint-Sulpice, the empty bars where, on weekend trips away from Paris, you can enjoy whispering long walks in the woods. In autumn, at Rambouillet, Vaux, and Compiègne, the most perfect pleasure proffered in every place to the ear, to the eye, and to the palate. And so, step by step, as they took their place in the real world, in a rather deeper way than in the past, when, as the children of middle-class families of no substance, and then as undifferentiated students without individual form, they had had but a superficial and skimpy view of the world. That is how they began to grasp what it meant to be a person of standing. This concluding revelation, which, strictly speaking, was not a revelation at all, but the culmination of the long drawn-out process of their social and psychological maturing, and of which they would not have been able to describe the steps without a great deal of difficulty, put the final touch on their metamorphosis. 4. Life, for them and their circle of friends, was often a whirlwind. There was a whole crowd of them. They made a fine bunch. They knew each other well, taking a lot from each other. They had common habits, common tastes, and shared memories. They had their own vocabulary, their own marks, their special ideas. Too sophisticated to be perfectly similar to each other, but probably not sophisticated enough to avoid imitating each other more or less consciously. They spent a large part of their lives swapping things. They felt irritated by that often enough, but even more often they found it amusing. Almost all of them belonged to advertising circles. Some, however, were still pursuing, or trying to pursue, some kind of degree course or other. Most often they had met in the flashy or pseudo-functional setting of an agency boss's office. They would listen side by side, aggressively penciling on their blotters their petty suggestions and their grisly jokes, their shared contempt for those fat cats, those profiteers, for those eyewash merchants, was sometimes their first meeting ground. But most often they felt at first as if they had been sentenced to spending 5 or 6 days together in dreary small-town hotels. At each meal taken they would invite friendship to share their table. But lunches were hasty and businesslike, dinners dreadfully slow, unless something ignited that miraculous spark which would brighten their mournful traveling salesmen's faces, make this evening in the provinces a memorable occasion, and turn a very ordinary pâté put on the bill as an extra by some crooked hotelier into a succulent treat. Only then could they forget their tape recorders, abandon the over-guarded tones of senior psychologists. They would linger at the dinner table. They would talk about themselves and about things in general, about nothing in particular, about their tastes and their ambitions. They would scour the town to find the one really comfortable bar it simply had to have, and, until a very late hour, in front of whiskies, brandies, gins, and tonic, they would conjure up, with an almost ritualized carefree abandon, the stories of their love affairs, their desires, their travels, the things they wouldn't do, the things they adored passionately, without being surprised about. On the contrary, being almost delighted by. The likeness of their different histories, the sameness of their points of view. Sometimes these nascent sympathies gave birth only to distant acquaintance, telephone calls at lengthening intervals. Sometimes too, though rather less often in fact, whether by chance or by mutual desire, they set in train, slowly or less slowly, a potential friendship which would develop in stages. In that way, over the years, they had slowly knit together. They were, all of them, easily identifiable. They had money, not too much, but enough to fall only intermittently, because of some crazy purchase, perhaps superfluous, perhaps necessary, they really wouldn't have been able to say which, into genuine debt. Their flats, flatlets, lofts, 2-roomed conversions, in dilapidated houses, in selected neighborhoods, Palais Royal, Contrescarpe, Saint-Germain, Luxembourg, Montparnasse, were very similar. The same dirt-encrusted sofas, the same allegedly rustic tables, the same heaps of books and records, old glassware and old jars used indiscriminately for flowers, pencils, small change, cigarettes, sweets, and paper clips. They dressed roughly in the same fashion, that is to say, with that middling tastefulness which, for men as for women, is what is so right about Madame Express, and, by repercussion, about her husband also. What is more, they owed a great deal to that ideal couple in the women's pages of their favorite weekly magazine. L'Express was without doubt the one weekly magazine to which they paid heed. They didn't actually like it very much, but they bought it, or, at the least, borrowed it from each other, read it regularly and often, they confessed, even kept back numbers. As a matter of fact, they disagreed very frequently with the political line taken by L'Express. On one occasion, they had penned in righteous indignation a slim pamphlet against the style of the lieutenant editor, and for news analysis they preferred Le Monde by far, which they subscribed to faithfully to a man, or even the positions adopted by Libération, which they tended to consider a decent sort of newspaper. But L'Express, and that magazine alone, matched their art of living. Each week they would find it in its pages, and did not matter whether they could view them justifiably as misrepresented or distorted, the really current issues in their daily lives. Not infrequently they took offense. For in all honesty, the style, heavily marked by false modesty, the implied meanings, the veiled contempt, the ill-digested envy, the shallow crazes, the kicks in the shins, the knowing winks, together with the great advertising parade which made up L'Express in its entirety, its end and not its means, its most necessary aspect, as well as those little details which mean everything, those bargain items which were supposed to be really fun, those businessmen who understood the real issues, those specialists who knew what they were talking about and made sure you knew it too, those bold thinkers, pipe-suckers all, who were dragging the world into the 20th century. In short, that panel of responsible directors who foregathered each week around a table or in a forum, and whose po-faced smiles made you think they were still clasping in their right hands the golden key to the manager's toilets. All that could not fail to make them think, as they repeated the not very good pun with which their pamphlet had begun, that though it was not obvious that L'Express was a left-wing paper, it was as clear as daylight that it was a sinister one. That wasn't right either, as they well knew, but it reassured them. They didn't hide from the fact that they were made for L'Express. No doubt they needed their freedom, their intelligence, their high spirits, and their youth to be, at all times and in all places, properly represented. They allowed L'Express to take them under its wing, because it was the simplest thing to do, because their contempt for it kept their consciences clear. And the harshness of their judgment was equalled only by the extent of their submission to it. They thumbed through the magazine muttering curses. They would crumple it up and throw it away. They would go on for hours, sometimes, in high dudgeon at its outrageousness. But they read it, indisputably, and they took it all in. Where could they have found a truer image of their tastes and yearnings? Were they not young? Were they not wealthy, up to a point? L'Express held out to them all the signs of comfortable living. Thick bathrobes, brilliant unravelings of murky truths, fashionable beaches, exotic cookery, useful tips, intelligent news analysis, the secrets of the gods, places out in the sticks where you could pick up property for almost nothing, the names of the different Carolyn Bells, new ideas, smart outfits, frozen foods, elegant accessories, the scandals of polite society, up to the minute advice. They would dream, half aloud, of Chesterfield settees. L'Express would dream with them. They would spend a large part of their holidays doing the country house auctions. There, at bargain prices, they acquired pewter, straw-bottomed chairs, glasses that asked to be drunk from, horn-handled knives, shiny bowls which they made into precious ashtrays. All these things, they knew, had been, or would be mentioned in the L'Express. Their actual purchasing practice, however, was quite significantly different from the shopping habits put forward by L'Express. They were not yet quite settled down, and although their executive status was broadly acknowledged, they did not enjoy the job security or the bonus payments or the salary enhancements of permanent staff under contract. L'Express suggested, in that case, by way of pleasant but inexpensive boutiques. The boss is a pal. He'll give you a drink and an open sandwich whilst you're making up your mind. Little businesses where fashion had required, in order to create an appropriate impression, a thoroughgoing improvement of all previous fixtures and fittings. Whitewashed walls were indispensable, dark brown carpeting a necessity, which could be replaced only by a mosaic of antiquated floor tiles of different kinds. Exposed beams were obligatory, and little internal staircases, real fireplaces with a fire burning, rustic, or, even better, Provençal furniture were highly recommended. These conversions, which were spreading across Paris and affecting, indiscriminately, bookshops, art galleries, haberdashers, novelty and furniture stores, and even grocers' shops. It was not uncommon to see some formerly down-at-heel corner-shop grocer turn into a cheese consultant, complete with a blue apron, giving him a very expert heir, and his shop acquire roof beams and straw decking. Such conversions, therefore, brought more or less legitimately in their wake a rise in prices such that the purchase of a raw wool, hand-printed dress, of a cashmere twin-set woven by a blind Orkney crofter, exclusive, genuine, vegetable-dyed, hand-spun, hand-woven, or of a sumptuous Jersey wool and leather jacket, for week-end wear, for hunting, for driving, proved permanently impossible. They would eye the wares of antique dealers closely, but to furnish their flat they actually relied on country sales or the less publicized auctions at Drouot, and even there they went less often than they would have liked. Similarly, all of them only enlarged their stock of clothes by assiduous excursions to the flea market, or, twice a year, to jumble sales, organized by English ladies in aid of the St. George's English Church's charitable works, where there were plenty of diplomats' cast-offs, in perfectly acceptable condition, of course. Often they felt awkward about it. They would have to push their way through a milling crowd and rummage through piles of ghastly stuff. The taste of the English is not all it's cracked up to be, before unearthing a splendid tie, no doubt too frivolous for an embassy under-secretary, or a shirt that had once been exquisite, or a skirt that would just need taking up. But, of course, it was that or nothing. The incommensurability, perceptible in every domain, between the quality of their taste in clothing, nothing was too fine for them, and the amount of money they normally had available was an obvious, if ultimately secondary, sign of their material situation. They were not the only ones. Rather than shop at the sales, which happened everywhere 3 times a year, they preferred to buy second-hand. In the world that was theirs, it was almost a regulation always to wish for more than you could have. It was not they who had decreed it. It was a social law, a fact of life, which advertising in general, magazines, window displays, the street scene, and even, in a certain sense, all those productions which in common parlance constitute cultural life, expressed most authentically. That was why they were wrong to feel, on some occasions, that they were losing their dignity. For minor mortifications, having to ask the price of something, hesitantly, having to think twice, trying to haggle, window shopping, not daring to go in, wanting, appearing mean and petty, were also what kept businesses going. They were proud of having got something cheap, of having spent nothing on it, hardly a penny. They were even prouder, but the pleasure of paying too much for something has its own price, which is always a bit too high, to have paid a great deal, the highest possible price, on an impulse, without questioning, almost in blind excitement, for something that could not fail to be the finest, uniquely fine, perfect. These moments of shame and pride both had the same function, brought identical disappointments, identical inner rages. And they grasped, since all around them, everywhere, everything made them grasp, since slogans, posters, neon-lit signs, and flood-lit shop windows drummed it into their heads from morning till night, that they were forever one rung down on the ladder, always one rung too low, even though they were fortunate enough not to be, not by a long chalk, at the bottom of the pile. They were the new generation, young executives who had not yet cut all their teeth, technocrats on the way, but only halfway, to success. Almost all of them came from the lower middle classes, whose values, they felt, were for them no longer adequate. They cast their eyes enviously, desperately, towards the visible comfort, luxury, and perfection of the upper middle classes. They had no past, no tradition. There were no inheritances to wait for. Of all of Jérôme's and Sylvie's friends, only one came from wealthy, well-established family. They were textile wholesalers in Lille, with a comfortable pile conveniently invested in property in Lille, in a portfolio, a country house near Beauvais, gold and silver plate, jewelry, and roomfuls of antique furniture. All the others had spent their childhoods in dining rooms and bedrooms with imitation Chippendale or imitation rustic furniture, as such things were imagined initially at the dawn of the 1930s. Full-size beds covered with puce taffeta, 3-door wardrobes with mirrors and gilded mouldings, horribly square tables on turned wood legs, imitation antler coat stands, In such surroundings, in the evening, beneath the family lamp, they had done their homework. They had taken down the rubbish, they had gone off with the pail to fetch the milk, they had slammed doors behind them. Their memories of childhood were all similar, just as the paths they had followed, their slow departures from their family backgrounds, and the vistas they thought they had chosen for themselves, were identical. They were therefore of their own time. They were at ease with themselves. They were not, as they said, completely fooled. They could keep their distance. They were relaxed, or at least they tried to be. They had a sense of humor. They were by no means dim. A detailed analysis would have detected easily enough, within the group they constituted, divergent trends, stifled enmities. Any sociometrist with an eye for finicky detail would have easily discovered in their midst fault lines, reciprocal exclusions, latent hostilities amongst them. It sometimes happened that one or another of them, in response to some more or less fortuitous accident, or a camouflaged provocation, or a misunderstanding all in hints, would spread discord amongst them. Their fine friendship would then disintegrate. They would then realize, with simulated amazement, that X, whom they'd always thought a generous chap, was the very soul of stinginess, that Y was nothing but a desiccated egoist. Strains followed and matured into breakups. Sometimes they took malicious pleasure in setting one group up against another. Or alternatively, there were protracted periods of sulking, of pronounced distance, of coldness. They would avoid each other and continually find ways of justifying their avoidance, until the hour of forgiving, forgetting, and of reconciliation came around. For in the last analysis they could not manage without each other. They played these games intensely, and they spent on them precious time which they could have used without disadvantage to quite different ends. But they were such that, even if it occasionally irritated them, the group they constituted defined them almost entirely. Outside of it they had no real life. They were wise enough, nonetheless, not to see each other too often, not to work together always, and they even made an effort to keep up individual pursuits, private spheres to which they could withdraw, where they could forget, up to a point, not the group itself, the mafia, the team, but obviously the work on which it was based. Their almost shared lives made it easier to launch surveys, to go on trips to the provinces, to spend nights on analyses or on drafting reports, but it also tied them down to working like that. That, to tell the truth, was their awkward secret, their common weak spot. That was what they never mentioned. Their greatest pleasure was to forget together, that is to say, to indulge in distractions. They loved drinking, in the first place, and they drank a lot, often together. They were habitués of Harry's New York bar, denizens of Rue Danube, frequenters of the cafés in the Palais Royal arcades, of Le Balzar, of Lip, and a few other bars. They liked Munich beer, Guinness, gin, hot or cold punch, fruit liqueurs. Sometimes they spent whole evenings just drinking, huddled round 2 tables put together for the purpose, and they would talk, interminably, about the life they would have liked to lead, about the books they would write one day, about the things they would like to do, about the films they had seen or were going to see, the future of humanity, the political situation, their next holiday, their last holiday, an outing to the country, a short trip to Bruges, Antwerp, or Basel. And on occasions, as they plunged ever deeper into these collective daydreams, not seeking to wake from them but continually refueling them in unstated collusion, they would, eventually, lose all touch with reality. On such occasions, now and again, a hand would simply emerge from the conclave. The waiter was there, to clear the empty tankards and bring full ones, and then their conversation, as it once again thickened, would consist solely of matter related to what they had just drunk, to their drunkenness, their thirst, their happiness. They were in love with liberty. It seemed to them that the whole world was tailor-made for them. They lived at the exact tempo of their thirst, and their exuberance was irrepressible. Their enthusiasm knew no bounds. They could have walked, run, danced, sung all night. They wouldn't meet the day after. The couples would stay at home, dieting, feeling queasy, overindulging in black coffee and soluble aspirin. They would venture out only once night had fallen, to go and eat a plain steak in an expensive cafe. They would make draconian resolutions. No more smoking, no more drinking, no more wasting money. They would feel empty and stupid, and in their memory of their magnificent drinking bout there would always be a hint of yearning, a vague annoyance, a feeling of ambiguity, as if the very impulse which had made them drink had only reawakened in them a much deeper perplexity, a more hermetic contradiction from which they could not abstract themselves. Or else, in the flat of one or another of them, they would hold almost monstrous dinner parties, veritable feasts. For the most part they had only tiny and sometimes unusable kitchens, and mixed sets of crockery with an odd few rather high-class pieces amongst them. Extremely delicate cut glass stood on the table beside recycled mustard jars. Kitchen knives lay alongside little silver spoons with coats of arms. They would return all together from Rue Mouffetard, arms laden with edibles, with whole trays of melons and peaches, and baskets filled with cheeses, legs of lamb, poultry, and panniers of oysters in season, and dishes of pâté and fish roes, and, of course, with bottles, whole stacks of bottles of wine, port, mineral water, Coca-Cola. 9 or 10 people filled the narrow room, which was lit by a single window looking out onto the courtyard. A settee upholstered in coarse brown velvet occupied a recess at the far end. 3 would be placed there, at the table set in front of them, and the others would sit on unmatched chairs and on stools. They would eat and drink for hours on end. The exuberance and the copiousness of these meals were odd, to be honest, and from a strictly culinary point of view, they were rather poor meals. Roast meat and poultry without any sauce. The vegetables were almost invariably boiled or sauté potatoes, or even, on days before payday, the main dish might just be pasta or rice garnished with olives and some anchovies. They didn't experiment at all. Their most complicated dishes were melon and port, bananas flambé, cucumber salad and cream. It took them several years to realize that there was a technique, if not an art, of cookery, and that everything that they had enjoyed eating had been plain fare, unadorned, devoid of subtlety. In that respect they demonstrated the ambiguity of their situation in life. What they took to be a feast corresponded in every particular to the only kind of meals they had known for years, namely student canteen food. By dint of eating tough and wafer-thin steaks, they had taken to worshipping Chateaubriand and filet steaks. Meat and gravy, for years they looked askance at braised meat, did not attract them. They had too clear a memory of lumps of fat swimming around 3 slices of carrot in close proximity to a soggy piece of soft cheese and a spoonful of gelatinous jam. In a way, they liked anything which made a show without showing it had been cooked. They liked the visible signs of abundance and riches. They would have no truck with the slow process of elaboration which turns difficult raw materials into dishes, and which implies a whole world of pans, pots, slicers, strainers, and ovens. But the sight of salami sometimes almost made them faint, because it was all immediately and entirely edible. They liked pâtés and ready-made diced vegetable salads decorated with mayonnaise whorls, boned ham and eggs in aspic. They yielded too often to such temptations, and regretted it, once their eyes had had their fill, almost as soon as they plunged their forks into the jelly enhanced by a slice of tomato and 2 sprigs of parsley. After all, it was only a hard-boiled egg. Above all, they had the cinema, and this was probably the only area where they had learned everything from their own sensibilities. They owed nothing to models. Their age and education made them members of that first generation for which the cinema was not so much an art as simply a given fact. They had always known the cinema not as a fledgling art form, but, from their earliest acquaintance, as a domain having its own masterworks and its own mythology. Sometimes it seemed as if they had grown up with it, and that they understood it better than anyone before them had ever been able to understand it. They were cinema buffs. Film was their primordial passion. They indulged it every evening, or nearly. They loved the pictures as long as they were beautiful, entrancing, charming, fascinating. They loved the mastery of space, time, and movement. They loved the whirl of New York streets, the torpor of the tropics, fights in saloon bars. They were not excessively sectarian, like those dull minds which swear only by a single Eisenstein, Buñuel, or Antonioni, or even, as there is no accounting for tastes, by Carnet, Vidor, Aldrich, or Hitchcock. Nor were they too eclectic, like those infantile people who throw all critical sense to the winds and acclaim a director as a genius if he makes a blue sky look blue, or if the pale red of Sid Charisse's dress is made to clash with the darker red of Robert Taylor's sofa. They did not lack taste. They were highly suspicious of so-called art movies, with the result that when this term was not enough to spoil a film for them, they would find it even more beautiful. But they would say, quite rightly, that Marion Bad was all the same just a load of crap. They had an almost exaggerated feeling for westerns, for thrillers, for American comedies, and for those astonishing adventures full of lyrical flights, sumptuous images, and dazzling, almost inexplicable beauties, such as, the titles were imprinted on their minds forever, Lola, Bhowani Junction, The Bad and the Beautiful, Written on the Wind. They did not go to concerts at all often, and even less to the theatre. But they would meet, by chance, at the film theatre, at the Passy Cinema, or the Napoleon, or in little local flea pits, the Kursaal at Gobelins, the Texas at Montparnasse, the Bikini, the Mexico at Place Clichy, the Alcazar at Belleville, and others around Bastille or in the 15th arrondissement. Graceless, ill-equipped cinemas frequented by the unemployed, Algerians, aging bachelors, and film buffs, where they would see, in atrociously dubbed French versions, those unknown masterpieces they remembered for when they were 15, or those reputed works of genius, they had memorized the entire list, which they had been trying in vain for years to see. They would always remember with wonderment the blessed evening when they had discovered, or rediscovered almost by chance, The Crimson Pirate, The World in His Arms, Night and the City, My Sister Eileen, or The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. Alas, quite often, to tell the truth, they were horribly let down. Films they had waited so long for, as they had thumbed almost feverishly through the new issues of the Entertainment Guide every Wednesday. Films they had been told by almost everyone were magnificent, sometimes did finally turn out to be showing somewhere. They would turn up, every one of them, on the opening night. The screen would light up. They would feel a thrill of satisfaction. But the colors had faded with age. The picture wobbled on the screen. The women were of another age. They would come out. They would be sad. It was not the film they had dreamt of. It was not the total film each of them had inside himself, the perfect film they could have enjoyed forever and ever, the film they would have liked to make. Or, more secretly, no doubt, the film they would have liked to live. Five. So that was their life as they lived it, as their friends lived it, in cluttered and charming flats, with their outings and their films, their grand comradely dinner parties and their wondrous plans. They were not unhappy. Fleeting, surreptitious moments of bliss in living lit up their days. Some evenings, after dinner, they would linger at table to finish off a bottle of wine, nibble some nuts, light cigarettes. Some nights they wouldn't manage to get to sleep, and, half sitting up, propped up by pillows, an ashtray shared between them, they would talk until dawn. Some days they would walk and talk for hours on end. They would smile at each other's reflections in shop windows. It would seem to them that everything was perfect. They would walk unconstrainedly, with loose limbs, untouched, it seemed, by the passing of time. Simply being there in the street, on a crisp, cold, blustery day, wrapped in warm clothing, at dusk, proceeding smartly but unhurriedly towards a place of friendship, was enough to make their smallest gestures, lighting a cigarette, buying a bag of hot chestnuts, negotiating a way through the crowd at a station exit, appear to them as the direct and obvious expression of a boundless bliss. Or again, on some summer nights they would walk for miles through neighborhoods they did not know. The moon's round orb would shine high in the sky, casting its velvety light on everything. The long, wide, empty streets would reverberate with the sound of their footsteps as they walked all in step. Taxis would go by seldom, slowly, almost noiselessly. On such nights they had the world in their arms. It was unimaginably exhilarating, as if they had been entrusted with fabulous secrets and inexpressible powers. And they would hold hands and begin to run, or to play hopscotch, or to run a hopping race along the pavement, whilst bellowing in unison the great arias of Costi fan tutte, or the B minor Mass. Or again they would push open a door into a small restaurant, and joyfully, almost ritually, absorb the ambient warmth, the clutter of cutlery, the clinking of glasses, the muffled sounds of conversation, the inviting whiteness of napkins. They would select their wine punctiliously, unfold their napkins, and then it would seem to them, as they sat in the warm, in a close huddle, smoking a cigarette to be stubbed out in a moment's time, when the hors d'oeuvres would arrive, that their life was going to be only the infinite sum of such auspicious moments, and that they would always be happy, because they deserved to be happy, because they would manage to stay free, because happiness was within them. They would sit facing each other. They were going to eat after having been hungry, and all these things, the thick white tablecloth, the blue blot of a packet of gitans, the earthenware plates, the rather heavy cutlery, the stem glasses, the wicker basket full of newly baked bread, constituted the ever-fresh setting of an almost visceral pleasure, a pleasure so intense as to verge on numbness, an impression almost exactly opposite and almost exactly identical to the experience of speed, of a tremendous stability, of tremendous plenitude. From this table set for dinner arose from them the feeling of perfect synchrony. They were in tune with the world, they were swimming in it, in their element, with nothing to fear from it. Perhaps they were a bit more adept than others at making out or even provoking these auguries of good fortune. Their ears, their fingers, their palates, permanently on alert, as it were, lay in wait only for such propitious instants, which could be set off by minute details. But when they surrendered to those feelings of unruffled beatitude, of eternity undisturbed by the slightest ripple, when everything was in balance, deliciously slow, the very intensity of their bliss underlined the ephemerality and fragility of such instants. It did not take much to make it all crumble, the slightest false note, a mere moment's hesitation, a sign that was perhaps too vulgar, and their happiness would be put out of joint. It went back to being what it always had been, a kind of deal, a thing they had bought, a pitiful and flimsy thing, just a second's respite, which returned them all the more forcefully to the real dangers, the real uncertainties in their lives, in their history. The trouble with market researching is that it can't go on forever. The day was already marked down in Jérôme and Sylvie's history when they would have to choose between unemployment or underemployment, on the one side, or, on the other, a fuller kind of involvement in an agency, a full-time job, with executive status. Or else change their careers, find a job in some other line, but that would have only shifted the same problem to another terrain. For if it is commonly accepted that people who have not yet reached 30 may remain relatively independent and work as and when it suits them, even if their availability, openness of mind, the variety of their experience, and what is still called their adaptability is sometimes valued, it is on the other hand required, paradoxically, of any potential partner, once he has passed the milestone of his 30th birthday, and this is precisely what makes your 30th birthday a milestone, that he shows some evidence of stability, provides some guarantees as to his punctuality, discipline, judicious behavior. Employers, especially in advertising, not only decline to take on people over the age of 35, they are reluctant to rely on someone who, at the age of 30, has never been on the staff. No question, either, of carrying on using them as if nothing had changed, on short-term contracts. Such instability looks unconvincing. At 30, you owe it to yourself to have got somewhere, or else you are nowhere. And no one is anywhere unless he has found his niche, built his nest, got his own keys, his own desk, his own little nameplate. Jérôme and Sylvie thought often about this problem. They still had a few years left, but the life they led, the entirely relative peace they enjoyed, would never be a permanent possession. Everything would crumble progressively. They would have nothing left. They did not feel crushed by their work. They were sure of a living, more or less, for better or worse, taking the rough with the smooth, without the profession consuming the whole of their lives. But that was not destined to last. You can never remain just a market researcher for very long. Almost as soon as they are trained, researchers rush towards the higher rungs, to become deputy director or director of an agency, or to find one of those coveted jobs in some big firm, as director of, say, recruitment or staff training, or industrial relations. These are the plum jobs: carpeted offices, 2 telephones, a dictaphone, a refrigerated cocktail cabinet, and even sometimes, hanging on the wall, a painting by Bernard Buffet. Alas, said Jérôme and Sylvie to themselves very often, and sometimes to each other, you have to work to earn your crust, that's obvious. But if you work, you do not live. They thought they had learned that, in years gone by, from experience, of a few weeks' duration. Sylvie had become a filing clerk in a market research consultancy, whilst Jérôme coded and decoded interview questionnaires. Their working conditions were more than pleasant. They turned up when they liked, read the newspapers in the office, went down for a beer or a coffee quite often, and they even felt a degree of liking for the work they performed in dilatory fashion, led on as they were by an exceedingly vague promise of proper employment on a regular contract and accelerated promotion. But they didn't stick it out for very long. They were atrociously grumpy and getting up, full of resentment every evening. Going home on the overcrowded metro, they would slump onto their sofa, dog-tired and dirty, and do nothing but dream of long weekends, free days, and not getting up in the morning. They felt locked in, trapped, done for. They could not resign themselves to such a fate. They still believed that masses of things could happen to them, that it was the fixed daily hours of work, the unending sequence of days and weeks that made the straitjacket which they did not hesitate to describe as infernal. It was, all the same, and whatever else might be said about it, the start of a fine career. It held out good prospects for them. They were at that epic stage when the boss assesses you as a youngster, feels privately pleased with himself for having taken you on, gets straight down to training you, to shaping you in his own image, invites you to dinner, gives you a friendly thump, and, with a wave of his hand, opens your door to fortune. They were stupid. How many times did they repeat to themselves that they were stupid, that they were wrong, that they were in any case no more right than the others, the ones who hang on determinedly and cling? But they liked their long days of idleness, their lazy wakings, their mornings in bed with a pile of detective novels and science fiction beside them. They liked their walks in the night, down by the riverside, and the almost elating sense of freedom that they felt on some days, the feeling of holiday time which overcame them each time they got back from a campaign in the provinces. Of course they knew it was all wrong, that their freedom was just a will-o'-the-wisp. Their lives were much more marked by almost panic-stricken hunting for work each time, and there were many. One of the agencies they worked for went bust or got taken over by a bigger firm, by their days before pay when cigarettes had to be counted out one by one, by the time it took, on some days, to get invited out for a meal. They were right in the middle of the most idiotic, the most ordinary predicament in the world. But knowing it was idiotic and ordinary did not prevent them from being right in it. Long ago they had let slip work and freedom, had ceased to be strict opposites. All the same, it was that opposition which was, for them, the determining factor. People who chose to earn money first, people who put off their real plans until later, until they are rich, are not necessarily wrong. People who want only to live, and who reckon living as absolute freedom, the exclusive pursuit of happiness, the sole satisfaction of their desires and instincts, the immediate enjoyment of the boundless riches of the world. Jérôme and Sylvie had taken on this vast program for themselves. Such people will always be unhappy. It is true, they would admit, that there are people for whom this kind of dilemma does not arise, or hardly arises, either because they are too poor and have no requirements beyond a slightly better diet, slightly better housing, slightly less work, or because they are too rich, from the start, to understand the import or even the meaning of such a distinction. But nowadays, and in our part of the world, more and more people are neither rich nor poor. They dream of wealth and could become wealthy, and that is where their misfortunes begin. Let us take a young man who does a year or two at university, then completes his military service honorably. Around the age of 25, there he is, as naked as the day he was born, although he is also, by virtue of his education, already in virtual possession of more money than he has ever wished for. That is to say, he knows with certainty that the day will come when he will have his flat in the city, his country cottage, his car, his hi-fi. It so happens, however, that these elating promises continue to evade his actual grasp. By their very nature they belong to a process which also includes, if you care to think about it, marriage, parenthood, a change in values, social attitudes and patterns of personal behavior. In short, our young man will have to settle down, and it will take him 15 years. Such a prospect is not comforting. No one embarks upon it without protest. For Christ's sake, our young lad thinks, am I going to have to spend my days behind these glass walls instead of going for walks in flowery meadows? Am I going to catch myself hoping the night before each promotion exercise? Am I going to calculate, connive, champ my bit, me who used to dream of poetry, of night trains, of warm sandy beaches? And, taking it mistakenly to be a consolation, he falls into the trap of hire purchase. Then he is caught, well and truly caught. All he can do is gird up his patience. Alas, when he gets to the end of his troubles, our young man is no longer quite so young, and, to cap his misfortune, it can even seem to him that his life is behind him, that it consisted only of his striving and not of what he strove for. And even if he is too cautious, too sensible, his slow climb has given him plenty of experience. To dare to say such things to himself, it will none the less be true that he will be 40, and straightening out his home and his weekend place and his children's education will have filled more than adequately the few hours he will have been able to spare from his work. Impatience, thought Jérôme and Sylvie, is a 20th century virtue. At 20, when they saw, or thought they saw, what life could be, the sum of bliss it held, the endless conquests it allowed, etc., they realized they would not have the strength to wait. Like anyone else, they could have made it, but all they wanted was to have it made. That is probably the sense in which they were what are commonly called intellectuals. For everything contradicted them, beginning with life itself. They wanted life's enjoyment, but all around them enjoyment was equated with ownership. They wanted to stay free and virtually innocent, but time went by notwithstanding, and brought them nothing. The others ended up seeing wealth as an end to itself, but as for them, they didn't have any money at all. They told themselves they weren't the worst off. Perhaps they were right, but modern life irritated their misfortune whilst it erased the misfortunes of others. The others were on the right track. Jérôme and Sylvie didn't amount to much, penny scrabblers, freelancers, flitters. On the other hand, time, in a certain sense, was actually on their side. They had an image of a possible world which could seem exhilarating. But this, they agreed, was by way of consolation pretty small beer. 6. They had put down roots in a temporary soil. They did their work in the way others study, choosing their own hours. They could waste time like only students can. But on all sides dangers lurked. They would have liked their story to be a story of happiness, but more often than not it was a tale of happiness under threat. They were still young, but the years were going by fast. An old student is a gruesome thing. A burnt-out case is more gruesome still. They were afraid. They had free time, but time was also working against them. There were bills for gas, electricity, and the telephone that had to be paid. Every day they had to eat. They had to have clothes. They had to redecorate, change the sheets, take the washing to the laundry, get shirts ironed, buy shoes, catch the train, buy furniture. Money sometimes consumed them entirely. They did not stop thinking about it. Even their emotional life, to a considerable extent, depended on it directly. There was every reason to think that when they had a little wealth, when they got a breathing space, their shared happiness was indestructible. No constraint appeared to limit their love. Their tastes, imagination, new ideas, and appetites blended indistinguishably into freedom. But these were privileged moments. More often they had to struggle. At the first signs of overspending, quite often they would rise up against each other. They would clash over nothing. For a wasted 100 old francs, for a pair of stockings, for not doing the washing up. Then for hours on end, for whole days at a stretch, they stopped speaking to each other. They would dine hurriedly, opposite one another, each for himself, for herself, not looking. They would sit at opposite ends of the sofa, half turning their backs on each other. One or the other would play patience, interminably. Money stood like a barrier between them. It was a wall, a kind of buffer they banged against at every turn. It was something worse than poverty, a narrow, straitened, exiguous absence of ease. They inhabited the closed world of their closed lives, without a future, without openings other than impossible miracles, stupid dreams which wouldn't hold water. They were suffocating. They felt they were sinking. They could, of course, talk of other things, about a recent book, a theatre director, about the war in Algeria, or about people, but it sometimes felt as if their only real conversations were about money, comfort, and happiness. That was when their voices would rise, the tensions grow. They would talk, and, as they talked, they would feel just how impossible, unreachable, and paltry these things were. They would grow irritated. They were over-anxious. They would feel implicitly challenged, each by the other. They would dream up holiday plans, travel plans, plans for the flat, and then tear them down, rabidly. It would seem as if what was most real in their lives would then appear in its true light as something without substance, something absent. So they would fall silent, and their silence was full of rancor. They resented life, and sometimes were weak enough to resent each other. They remembered their messed-up degrees, their unappealing holidays, their drab life, their cluttered flat, their impossible dreams. They would look at each other. They would find the other partner ugly, badly dressed, graceless, crumpled. Beside them, in the street, cars slid slowly on. In the city squares, the neon lights flashed in turn. At the cafe terraces, people looked like complacent fish. They hated the world. They went home on foot, tired out. They went to bed without saying a word. If someday something were to give way, such as an agency going out of business, or their being seen as too old or too unreliable in their work, or one of them falling ill, that was all it would take for everything to come tumbling down. They had no prospects, no reserves. Their minds often turned to this subject, anxiously. They would come back to it incessantly, in spite of themselves. They could see themselves out of work for months on end, taking on penny jobs just to survive, borrowing, begging. Then, sometimes, they would experience moments of intense despair. They would dream of offices, of established posts, of regular hours, of proper contracts of employment. But these reversed images threw them into perhaps even greater despair. They just could not, so they thought, recognize themselves in the face of a desk-bound executive, however splendid his apparel. They decided that they detested hierarchies, and that solutions, miraculous or other, would come from elsewhere, from the world, from history. They went on in their bumpy way. It fitted their natural inclination. In an imperfect world, of this they convinced themselves easily, it was not by any means the most imperfect way. They lived for the day. In 6 hours they would spend what it had taken 3 days to earn. They often borrowed. They ate ghastly French fries, smoked their last cigarette between them, sometimes spent 2 hours looking for a spare metro ticket, wore recycled shirts, listened to scratched records, hitchhiked to get to places, and quite frequently still put off changing the sheets for 5 or 6 weeks. They were quite near to believing that, all in all, this kind of life was not without its charm. Seven. When they talked to each other about their kind of living, their way of life, their future, when they surrendered themselves in a kind of frenzy, and entirely, to an orgy of better worlds, they sometimes said, with a rather hollow melancholy, that they had not sorted things out properly in their minds. They saw the world through muddled eyes, and the clarity they proclaimed as a value was often accompanied by indecisive fluctuations, ambiguous compromises, and assorted other considerations which modulated, minimized, or even undermined entirely what were, quite obviously still, their good intentions. It seemed to them that there they had found a path, or an absence of a path, which defined them perfectly, and not just them, but all those of their age. Earlier generations, they would sometimes tell each other, had probably found it possible to reach a fuller awareness of themselves and of the world they lived in. They would have liked, perhaps, to have been 20 during the Spanish Civil War, or during the Resistance. In fact, they talked about it a great deal. It seemed to them that the problems facing people then, the problems they imagined people facing, were clearer, even if the need to respond had turned out to be more pressing. As for themselves, the questions that faced them were all booby traps. Their nostalgia was slightly hypocritical. The Algerian War had begun with them and was being pursued before their eyes. It hardly affected them. They took action on occasions, but they rarely felt obliged to do so. For years they didn't imagine that their lives, their future, their ideas might one day be turned upside down by it. But that is what happened, up to a point, at one time in the past. In their student days they had come to participate more spontaneously and often almost enthusiastically in the meetings and street demonstrations which had greeted the outbreak of the war, the call-up of the reserve, and, especially, the coming of Gaullism. In those days there seemed to be a connection, directly established, between what they did in their own small sphere and what they aimed to do. And you couldn't really reproach them for having been, as it turned out, quite wrong. The war didn't cease. Gaullism didn't go away. Jérôme and Sylvie dropped their studies in advertising circles, which were generally located by quasi-mythical tradition to the left of center, but were rather better defined by technocracy, the cult of efficiency, modernity, complexity, by the taste for speculating on future trends, and by the more demagogic strain in sociology, as well as by the still very widespread opinion that 9/10 of the population were fools just able to sing the praises of anything or anybody in unison. In advertising circles, then, it was fashionable to despise all merely topical political issues and to grasp history in nothing smaller than centuries. It happened to be the case, furthermore, that Gaullism was an adequate response, an infinitely more dynamic response than people had at first declared far and wide that it should be, and that its danger lay always in some other place than the one where people thought they had found it. The war dragged on all the same, even if they saw it only as an episode, as a fact of an almost secondary nature. They had a bad conscience about it, of course, but their feeling of responsibility went no deeper than their memory of having been affected by it in the past, than a virtually automatic allegiance to moral imperatives of a very broad and unspecific kind. Such indifference could have given them a measure of the true strength of many of their bursts of passion, of their pointlessness, even perhaps of their gutlessness. But the real question lay elsewhere. They had watched with something approaching surprise as some of their old friends got themselves involved, cautiously or wholeheartedly, in helping the FLN, the Algerian freedom fighters. They hadn't really grasped why, and could not manage to take seriously either the romantic explanation, which tended rather to make them smile, or the political explanation, which passed their understanding almost entirely. As for themselves, they had solved the problem far more simply. Jérôme and 3 of his friends, relying on valuable contacts in high places and fraudulent doctor's certificates, had managed to get themselves exempted from military service in time, on health grounds. Yet it was the war in Algeria and the war alone which for almost 2 years protected them from themselves. After all, they might have aged less well or less slowly. But it was not by their own decisions, nor by acts of their own volition, nor even, whatever they might have claimed, by their sense of humour that they succeeded for some considerable time in deferring a future which they painted, self-indulgently, in blackest hue. The events of 1961 and 1962, from the Algiers general's putsch to the massacre at Sharon metro station, which heralded the end of the war, enabled them, temporarily but with uncommon effectiveness, to forget, or rather, to suspend their habitual concerns. Their gloomiest forecasts, their fear of never making it, of ending up in some obscure and narrow rut, looked a good deal less dreadful, on some days, than what was happening before their eyes, than what threatened them day by day. Those were sad and violent times. Housewives stocked up with sugar in kilos, bottles of cooking oil, tins of tuna, coffee and condensed milk. Squads of helmeted security policemen in shiny black waterproof capes and service boots patrolled at ease up and down Boulevard Sebastopol, carrying cavalry rifles. Because the back seats of their cars were often strewn with a few out-of-date issues of newspapers, which some touchy individuals could be expected to consider demoralizing, subversive, or just plain liberal, Le Monde, Libération, France Observateur, Jérôme and Sylvie and their friends fell prey on occasions to furtive fears and worrying hallucinations. They were being followed, their number plates were being taken down, they were being watched, being framed. 5 wine-sodden foreign legionnaires were going to set upon them and leave them for dead in a dark alley, on the rain-washed pavement in a neighbourhood of ill repute. Thus martyrdom burst into their daily lives, became, on occasions, an obsession, and, it seemed to them, a characteristic of a particular group attitude, and it gave the days, the events, and the thoughts of this time their specific colouring. Visions of blood, of explosions, violence, and terror went with them always. It might seem on some days that they were ready for anything, but the next day life would be precarious, the future bleak. They would dream of exile, of the countryside, of long cruises. They wished they could live in England, where policemen are reputed to behave with respect for the individual. And all through that winter, as the ceasefires drew nearer and nearer, they would dream of the coming spring, of holidays to come, of the year ahead, when, as the papers said, fratricidal passions would have subsided, when it would be possible once again to saunter, to go out at night on foot with your mind at rest and your body safe and sound. The pressure of events led them to take a stand. They were committed, of course, only superficially. Their political consciousness, insofar as they had any such thing as a structured and considered set of thoughts, rather than an inchoate eruption of more or less consistently angled opinions, was, they thought, already beyond or above the Algerian issue, engaged with alternatives that were more utopian than real, with general questions which, they conceded with some regret, had little chance of producing any kind of practical result. Nonetheless, they joined the anti-fascist committee, which had just been set up in their area. They rose, on occasions, at 5 a.m. to go out, with 3 or 4 comrades, pasting up posters calling on people to be alert, denouncing the guilty and their stooges, protesting outrages and honouring the innocent victims. They took petitions round all the houses in their street, and 3 or 4 times did guard duty in threatened premises. They took part in some demonstrations. On such days there were buses on the streets without number plates. Cafes would shut early. People would hurry home. They were frightened all day long. They went out feeling uneasy. It was 5 o'clock and a thin drizzle was falling. They looked at the other demonstrators, smiling tensely, sought out their friends, tried to talk about other things. The marchers formed into columns, which moved forward, then came to a standstill. From the midst of the crowd they were in, they could see, in front of them, a great expanse of wet and gloomy tarmac, and then, taking up the whole width of the boulevard, the thick black line of the riot place. Cohorts of midnight blue pantechnicons, with wire netting over their windows, processed in the distance. They dragged their feet, holding hands, dripping with sweat, scarcely daring to shout, and ran off as soon as the first signal was given. It didn't add up to much. They were the first to be aware of this, and they often wondered, standing in the middle of the pack, what they were doing there, out in the cold, in the rain, in these sinister parts of town. Bastille, Nation, Hotel de Ville. They wished something would happen to prove that what they were doing was important, necessary, irreplaceable, that their fear-struck efforts would have a meaning for them, would be something they needed, something that might help them to know themselves, to change themselves, to live. No, their real lives were elsewhere, in a near or distant future also full of menace, but of a more subtle, less straightforward kind. Traps you could not touch, spellbound webs. The attempted assassination at Issy-les-Moulineaux and the brief demonstration which followed it marked the end of their militant activities. Their local anti-fascist committee held one more meeting and agreed to step up its activity. But as the holiday season was nearly upon them, there didn't really seem to be any good reason for them even to remain vigilant. Eight. They could not have said exactly what it was that changed when the war ended. For a long time it was as if the only impression they could feel was the sense of an ending, of something completed or concluded. Not a happy ending, not a dramatic resolution, but quite the opposite, a melancholy, dying fall, which left behind its feelings of emptiness, of bitterness, memories clouded over by darkness. Time had passed, time had fled, an era was over, peace had returned, a peace they had never known. The war came to an end. At a stroke, 7 years tipped into history, their student years, their years of making friends, the best years of their lives. Maybe nothing had changed. They would still sometimes stand at their window, looking at the courtyard, the tiny gardens, the chestnut tree, listening to the birds singing. Other books, other records were now piled up on their rickety bookshelves. The gramophone needle was beginning to wear out. Their work had stayed the same. They were doing the same surveys as 3 years before. What do you shave with? Do you put polish on your shoes? Had they seen films, and seen films again? Had they traveled and discovered other restaurants? They had bought shirts and shoes, jumpers and skirts, plates, sheets, and trinkets. What was new was terribly insidious, terribly vague, terribly bound up with their own unique story, with their dreams. They were weary. They had aged. Yes, they had. Some days they felt as if they still hadn't begun to live. But the life they were leading came more and more to seem to them a precarious and ephemeral thing, and they felt drained of strength, as if their waiting, their hardships, their pinched budgets had worn them out, as if all of it, unsatisfied desires, imperfect pleasures, wasted time, had been in the natural order of things. On occasions they wished everything would stay the same, not ever move. They would be able just to drift. Their life would keep them warm. It would stretch ahead through the months and years without, or almost without, altering, without ever hampering them. It would be but the harmonious sequence of their days and nights, the one almost imperceptibly modulating the other, a never-ending reprise of the same themes, a continuous happiness, a perpetuated enjoyment which no upset, no tragic event, no twist or turn of fate would ever bring into question. At other times they could not stand it a moment longer. They wanted to fight and to win. But how could they fight? Whom would they fight? What should they fight? They lived in a strange and shimmering world, the bedazzling universe of a market culture, in prisons of plenty, in the bewitching traps of comfort and happiness. Where were the dangers? Where were the threats? In the past, men fought in their millions, and millions still do fight for their crust of bread. Jérôme and Sylvie did not quite believe you could go into battle for a Chesterfield steady. But that was all the same the banner under which they would have enlisted most readily. There was nothing, they thought, that concerned them in party manifestos or in government plans. They would sneer at early retirement pension schemes, increased holiday entitlements, free lunches, the 30-hour week. They wanted superabundance, garroted turntables, empty beaches for their eyes only, round-the-world trips, grand hotels. The enemy was unseen, or rather, the enemy was within them. It had rotted them, infected them, eaten them away. They were the hollow men, the turkey round the stuffing. Tame pets, faithfully reflecting a world which taunted them. They were up to their necks in a cream cake from which they would only ever be able to nibble crumbs. For years the crises they had encountered had scarcely dented their good humor. They hadn't taken them as inevitable or terminal affairs. They were crises in which nothing was at stake. They often reflected that friendship was protecting them. The group held together, reliably, cohesively. It was a firm guarantee of their stability, a force they could count on. They were sure they were right because they knew they would stick together, and they liked nothing more than to be together at one or another's flat towards the end of an especially awkward month, sitting around a tureen of potatoes and bacon, sharing their last cigarettes as fraternally as it was possible to do. But friendships too began to fray. Some evenings, within the finite fields of their unspacious rooms, the couples that had come together crossed swords by word and eye. Some evenings they finally grasped that their fine friendships, their almost hermetic language, their private jokes, this shared world, shared language, the common gestures they had made up, were based on nothing. Theirs was a shrunken universe, a world running out of steam, opening onto nothing. Their lives were not conquests, but slow collapses, dispersions. That was when they realized how deeply they were condemned to habit, to sluggishness. They were bored in each other's company, as if all there had ever been between them was a void. Puns, boozing, walks in the woods, dinner parties, endless discussions about films, plans, gossip, had long stood in for adventure, history, and truth. But the words were hollow, the gestures empty, without substance, without consequence, without a future. Words repeated 1,000 times, hands shaken 1,000 times, ritual actions which no longer afforded them any protection. At that time they would spend an hour trying to agree about which film they would go see. They would talk just for the sake of talking, play at riddles or at guessing games. Each couple, when alone, would speak harshly of the others and sometimes of themselves. They would harp on their lost youth. They would recall having once been enthusiastic, spontaneous, brim-filled of real plans, of images and wealth, of desires. They would dream of new friendships, but they could barely manage to picture them. Slowly, but with inexorable obviousness, the group fell apart. With sometimes brutal suddenness, in the space of barely a few weeks, it became obvious to some of them that the life of old would never again be on. Their weariness was too great, the outside world too demanding. People who had lived in rooms with no running water, who had dined on a quarter of a stick loaf, who had believed they were living as they pleased, who had burnt the candle at both ends without running out of wick, such people, one fine day, settled down. They were swayed, almost naturally, almost objectively, by the temptation of a steady job, a staff appointment, bonus payments, and an extra salary check at Christmas. One after another, almost all their friends gave in. The age of rootless living gave way to the age of security. "We simply cannot," they would say, "go on like this all our lives." And they said "like this" with a vague wave of the hand towards, larking about, too little sleep, eating potatoes, worn-out jackets, hard work on low pay, public transport. Bit by bit, and without really noticing it happening, Jérôme and Sylvie ended up almost alone. Friendship was possible, it seemed to them, only when they were in the same boat, leading the same lives. But when one couple suddenly acquires what looks to the other couple like a fortune, or the firm prospect of a fortune, whilst the other, for its part, prizes the freedom it has clung to, there was what felt like a clash of two worlds. It was no longer a matter of passing squabbles, but of real splits, deep chasms, of wounds that would not close up all by themselves. Mistrust of a sort that would have been impossible a few months earlier had entered their relationships. They would be standoffish in conversation. They seemed to be forever challenging each other. Jérôme and Sylvie were harsh, or unfair about their friends. They spoke of treason and abdication. They took pleasure in observing at first hand the devastating damage which money, they claimed, would wreak upon those who had sacrificed everything on its altar, and from which damage they were, they thought, still exempt. They watched their old friends settle almost easily, almost too comfortably, into rigid hierarchies and unreservedly adopt the values of the world they were entering. They watched them scrape and wheedle and come on to believe in their power, their influence, their responsibilities. Through them they believed they could see the exact opposite of their own world, the one which gave justification, altogether, to money, work, advertising, skills, a world which gave value to experience, a world which gave them no place, no solemn world of executives, the world of power. They came close to believing that their friends were being taken for a ride. They did not despise money. Perhaps it was the opposite, that they loved it too much. They would have liked substance, certainty, a calm, clear way to the future. They were alert to all signs of permanence. They wanted to be rich. And if they still refused to make themselves rich, it was because they did not need a salary. Their imagination, their culture allowed them to think only in millions. They often went out in the evening, stiffing the air, ogling the window displays. They would push on past the 13th arrondissement, close to home, and of which they knew only Avenue des Gobelins because of its 4 cinemas. They would skirt around the sinister Rue Cuvier, which would have led them only to the even more sinister environs of Gare d'Austerlitz, and almost naturally would follow Rue Monde, then Rue des Cols onto Saint-Michel, Saint-Germain, and thence, according to their whim or the time of the year, to Palais Royal, Opera, Montparnasse, Vevey, Rue d'Assay, Saint-Sulpice, the Luxembourg Gardens. They walked slowly. They stopped at each antique dealer's, pressed their noses against ill-lit windows, made out, through the mesh shutters, the reddish glow of a leather sofa, the foliate decoration of an earthenware dish or plate, the gleam of cut glass or a brass candlestick, the elegant curve of a cane-seated chair. From one station to another, antique dealer, bookshops, record shops, restaurant menus, travel agencies, shirt makers, tailors, cheese shops, bootmakers, confectioners, delicatessens, stationers. Their pass through Paris constituted their real universe. In them lay their ambitions and hopes. That was where real life was, the life they wanted to know, that they wanted to lead. Was it not for these salmon, for these carpets, for these crystal glasses that, 25 years before, a shop girl and a lady's hairdresser had brought the two of them into this world? The next morning, when life once more ground away at them, when the great advertising machine in which they were tiny cogs once more started up, they would not have forgotten entirely, it seemed to them, the blurred treasures, the unveiled secrets of their fervent nighttime quest. They would sit opposite people who believed in the brands, the jingles, the images that were put in front of them, people who ate the dripping from beef brought in from a knacker's yard and found its hazelnut fragrance and plant-like odor quite delicious. But they did themselves, without knowing really why, and with an odd, almost worrisome feeling that they were not quite grasping something. Did they not admire some posters, find some slogans marvelous, reckon some trailers were brilliant? They would sit down and switch on their tape recorders. They would say "ah" and with the right intonation. They would fake their interviews, bungle their reports. They would be dreaming, muddle-headedly, of something else. 9. How could they make their fortune? They could find no solution to the problem. And yet, every day, so it seemed, there were individuals who managed to solve it for themselves. And these examples to be followed, these wise and smiling, sly and wilful faces full of health, firmness, and modesty, upholding to eternity the moral and intellectual resilience of the French nation, were nothing less than icons, instilling patience and right feelings in the others, in the ones who lagged behind, who stood still, champed their bit the dust. They knew all there was to know about the rise of such men kissed by fortune, captains of industry, incorruptible, glittering prize winners from École Polytechnique, financial wizards, men of letters without a smudge, globe-trotting pioneers, packet soup salesmen, suburban developers, crooners, playboys, gold diggers, jugglers of mammon. They had simple stories. They were still young and had kept their good looks, with that dull gleam of experience in their eyes, graying hair on their temples to show for their years of struggle, with frank, engaging smiles concealing sharp teeth, double-jointed fingers, seductive voices. They could easily imagine themselves fitting into such a role. They would have a 3-actor in the bottom drawer. Their garden plot would be sitting on oil or uranium. They would live for years in poverty, hardship, and doubt. They would dream of going first class just once on the metro. And then, suddenly, brutally, wildly, unexpectedly, like a thunderclap, fortune! Their play would be accepted, their mineral deposit discovered, their genius acclaimed. Contracts would rain down, and they would light their Havanas with 1,000-franc banknotes. It would be a morning like any other. Under the front door 3 envelopes would be slipped, long and narrow, with impressive embossed official lettering and the address accurately typed with perfect spacing on an IBM executive. Their hands would shake a little as they opened them. There would be 3 checks with long strings of numbers on them, or else a letter. Dear Sir, your uncle, Mr. Palmgrease, having died intestate. And they would pass their hands over their faces, not believing their eyes and thinking they were still dreaming. They would open the window wide. Thus did they dream, stupidly, happily, of inheritances, jackpots, winning at the races. Someone would break the bank at Monte Carlo. They would find a satchel abandoned in the luggage rack of some empty railway carriage, stuffed with wads of high-denomination notes, and a dozen oysters, enough pearls to make a string. Or a couple of wool armchairs bought off an illiterate peasant in Puteaux. They would be carried away by great surges, sometimes for hours on end, for days at a stretch. A frenzy of desire to be rich, immediately, enormously, and forever, would seize them and hold them in its grip. It was an insane, unwholesome, oppressive desire which seemed to control their slightest movement. Fortune became their opium. It intoxicated them. They surrendered unreservedly to the delirium of their fantasies. Wherever they went, they paid heed only to money. They had nightmares of millions of gems. They would attend the big auctions at Drouot and Galleria. They would mingle with gentlemen examining pictures, catalogue in hand. They watched Degas pastels, rare postage stamps, stupid gold coins, fragile editions of La Fontaine and Crébillon, luxuriously bound by Lederer, admirable pieces of furniture bearing the mark of Claude Seine or Ohlenberg, gold or enamel snuff-boxes being sold off. The auctioneer presented the lots in turn. Some people with serious faces went to cast an eye over them. Murmurs passed through the crowd. The bidding began. Prices climbed. Then the hammer fell, and it was over. The object disappeared. 5 or 10 million francs had gone by within reach of their hands. Sometimes they trailed the new owners. These happy mortals were most often only underlings, antique dealers' buyers, private secretaries, straw men. They would be led by them to the portals of austere mansions in Voie Oswaldo Cruz, Boulevard Beausejour, Rue Maspero, Rue Spontini, Villa Sede, Avenue de Roule. Beyond the railings, box shrubberies and gravel drives, incompletely drawn curtains sometimes gave them a glimpse of large, barely lit rooms. They could make out vaguely the shapes of the sofas and armchairs, the blurred brushstrokes of an impressionist painting. And they would beat their retreat, wistful and grumpy. One day they even dreamed of stealing. They imagined, at length, dressing in black, and, with a tiny flashlight in one hand, and a jemmy and a glass cutter in their pocket, entering a building after nightfall, getting into the cellars, forcing the primitive lock on a dumbwaiter, reaching the kitchens. It would be a flat belonging to a diplomat on service overseas, of a shady financier with none the less perfect taste, of a distinguished dilettante, of an enlightened art lover. They would know every nook and cranny. They would know where to find the little 12th century Madonna, the oval panel by Sebastiano del Piombi, the Fragonard wash painting, the 2 small Renoirs, the little Boudin, the Atlin, the Max Ernst, the de Staels, the coins, the musical boxes, the candy boxes, the silverware, the Delft china. They would move with precision and firmness, as if they had rehearsed it all many times over. They would move unhurriedly, confidently, efficiently, imperturbably, phlegmatically. The Arsène Lupins of modern times. Not a muscle of their faces would twitch. One by one the showcases would be broken into, one by one the canvases would be taken down and removed from their frames. Their car would be waiting below. They would have filled the tank the day before. Their passports would be in order. They would have preparations for departure in hand for a long while. Their trunks would be in Brussels already. They would take the Flanders road, cross the Belgian border without hindrance. Then, little by little, without undue haste, in Luxembourg, in Antwerp, Amsterdam, London, the States, South America, they would sell off their booty. They would go round the world. They would wander for years, as the whim took them. They would settle eventually in a land with a pleasant climate. They would buy, somewhere, in the Italian lakes, or at Dubrovnik, in the Balearics, or Savalu, a large white stone house nestling in the middle of a park. They didn't do anything of the sort, of course. They didn't even buy a lottery ticket. At the very most they put into their poker games, a game they discovered at that time and which was set to become the last port of call for their creaky friendships, a restlessness which at times could look suspicious. Some weeks they played as many as 3 or 4 games, each one of which kept them up until the small hours. They played for small stakes, so small that they had only the foretaste of risk and the semblance of winnings. And yet, when, with 2 low pairs, or even better, with a 4-card flush, they threw on the table, at one go, a hatful of chips, worth at least 300 old francs, and scooped the pool, when they had upped the ante to 600 francs worth of IOUs, lost them in 3 calls, then won them, and more, back again in 6 calls, a modest smile of triumph would light their faces. They had pushed Lady Luck their way. Their sliver of courage had borne fruit. They were not far short of feeling like heroes. 10. A farming survey took them all over France. They went to Lorraine, Saintonge, Picardy, Beauce, Limoges. They met lawyers of ancient stock, wholesalers whose lorries covered a quarter of France, prosperous industrialists, gentlemen farmers always escorted by a pack of big russet dogs and watchful factors. The silos were full of wheat. In great cobbled courtyards sparkling tractors faced the squires' black saloon cars. They passed through the workers' canteen, the vast kitchen where women toiled, the great hall with its yellowing floor, where no one went without first replacing his shoes with felt slippers, and its massive fireplace, its television set, its wing chairs, light oak chests, brasses, pewter, china plate. Along a narrow passage impregnated with smells they came to a door opening on to an office. It almost seemed a small room, so great was the clutter. Beside an old hand-operated telephone mounted on the wall, a year planner summed up the life of a farming business. Cereals to be planted, plans, estimates, account days. A graph gave eloquent testimony to record yields. On a table piled high with receipts, payslips, memos, and bump, a black cloth-bound ledger, open on that day's page, gave sight of long columns of figures, of flourishing finances. Framed certificates for bulls milking cows' prize sows, jostled with bits of land registry charts, ordnance survey maps, portrait photographs of herds and farmyards, and 4-color printed prospectuses for tractors, threshers, grubbers, and drills. That was where they plugged in their tape recorders. They made grave inquiries about the changing place of agriculture in the modern world, the contradictions of the French countryside, the farmer of tomorrow, the common market, government rulings on wheat and beet, free-range methods and floor prices. But their minds were somewhere else. They could see themselves coming and going in the house when it had been abandoned. They would go up polished stairs, enter shuttered and musty bedrooms. Beneath dun canvas dust covers would be venerable pieces of furniture. They would open 9-foot-high wardrobes full of lavender-scented linen, preserving jars and silverware. In the half-light of attics they would discover unsuspected treasure. In unending cellars they would be welcomed by tons and hogsheads, vats full of oil and honey, barrels of preserves and brine, juniper roast ham, kegs of rough brandy. They would saunter through echoing laundry rooms, through wood stores, through coal stores, through fruit storerooms, where endless rows of apples and pears would be laid out on wicker trays, stacked on top of each other, through dairies with their unmistakable smell, where mountains of freshly made pats of butter would display their glorious, still dripping maker's mark, alongside churns of milk, panchins of fresh cream, cottage cheese, quark. They would go through cowsheds, stables, workshops, forges, barns, ovens where huge lumps of dough were baking, warehouses bursting with sacks, tractor sheds. From the top of the water tower they would be able to see the whole farmhouse enclosing all 4 sides, the great cobbled courtyard with its 2 pointed arch gateways, its backyard, piggery, kitchen garden, orchard, the avenue of plane trees marking the track that leads to the main road, and, all around, as far as the eye could see, the great striped yellowness of wheat fields, the thickets, the pasture land, the straight black lines of the roads on which occasionally you could see the passing glint of a car, and the wavy line of poplars all along a deeply embanked, almost invisible river, stretching to misty hills on the far horizon. Then, in gusts, other mirages swirled. They saw vast open markets, endlessly long arcades of shops, unbelievable restaurants. Everything man can eat, everything that could be drunk, was laid out before them. Chests, crates, baskets, trays spilling over with fat, yellow or red apples, squat pears, purple grapes. Stalls of mangoes, figs, honeydew and watermelon, lemons, pomegranates, sacks of almonds, walnuts, pistachios, punnets of raisins and sultanas, dried bananas, candied fruits, yellow and transparent dried dates. There were charcuteries, colonnaded temples with ceilings groaning with hams and sausages, dark caverns piled high with pâtés, and black puddings coiled up like ships' hawsers, barrels of sauerkraut, of purplish olives, of salted anchovies, of sweet pickled cucumber. Or else, on both sides of an alley, double ranks of suckling pigs and wild boars hanging by their feet, half-sides of beef, hares, fatted geese, deer with glazed eyes. They would pass through delicatessens redolent with delicious smells, wondrous patisseries with hundreds of tarts in a row, magnificent kitchens with 1,000 copper cauldrons. They would drown in plenty. They drained up huge market halls. Before their eyes arose Eldorados of hams, cheeses, and spirits. Tables set themselves fully laden, bedecked with sparkling white tablecloths, strewn with flowers, covered with cut glass and fine plate. There were pâtés en croûte by the dozen, terrines, salmon, pike, trout, lobster, dressed legs of ham with horn and silver-handled decorations, hare and quail, steaming boar, cheeses the size of millstones, regiments of bottles. Locomotives would appear hauling freight cars loaded with fatted cattle. Lorries bearing bleeding ewes would draw up. Baskets of crayfish would be piled up in pyramids. Millions of loaves would emerge from 1,000 ovens. Tons of coffee beans would be unloaded from ships' holds. Then, even further on, their eyes would be half closed now, amidst forest and lawns, by river banks, at the gates of the desert, or on a cliff overlooking the sea, on great squares paved with marble. They would see skyscrapers rise 100 stories high. They would wander by their walls of steel, tropical wood, glass, and marble. In the center foyer, all along a cut-glass partition beaming millions of rainbows throughout the building, a waterfall would spout from the 5th-floor level, encircled by the dizzy spiral of twin aluminum stairwells. Lifts bore them upwards. They went down curving corridors, walked up crystal steps, through luminous galleries where statues and flowers stood in lines as far as the eye could see, where limpid brooks flowed on beds of polychrome pebbles. Doors opened in front of them. They came upon open-air swimming pools, patios, reading rooms, quiet rooms, theaters, aviaries, gardens, aquariums, tiny museums for their sole use, where, on the 4 canted sides of a small room with cut-off corners, 4 Flemish portraits were hung. Some rooms were all in rock, others all jungle. In others the sea broke in waves, and in others peacocks paraded. From the ceiling of a circular room hung thousands of aura flames. Inexhaustible mazes echoed with sweet music. One room with an outlandish shape served no other purpose, it seemed, than to set off unending echoes. The floor of another room represented at different times of the day the different stages in a very complicated game. In the enormous basement, as far as the eye could see, docile machinery worked away. They would drift from marvel to marvel, from surprise to surprise. All they had to do was to live, to be there, for the world to offer itself to them whole. Their ships, their trains, their rockets crisscrossed the planet. The world was in their arms, with its wheat-covered counties, its fish-full seas, its peaks and its deserts, its flowery landscapes, beaches, islands, trees, and treasures, with its huge and long-abandoned factories buried underground, making the finest woolen cloths and the brightest silks for them alone. They knew countless joys. They let themselves be swept along by galloping wild horses, through the long grass of great storm-tossed pampas. They climbed the highest mountains. Wearing skis, they swept down steep slopes dotted with enormous pine trees. They swam in glassy lakes. They marched in the driving rain, breathing in the smell of wet grass. They lay out in the sun. From an outcrop they saw hillocks covered in the flowers of the field. They walked through the unsignposted forest. They made love in rooms thick with shade, thickly carpeted on deep settees. Then they dreamed of exquisite porcelain decorated with tropical birds, of leather-bound books printed in Elsevier on handmade Japanese vellum, with wide white margins and rough edges on which the eye could rest, of mahogany tables, of supple, comfortable, colorful silk or linen clothing, of bright and spacious rooms, of armfuls of flowers, of Bokhara rugs, of bouncing Dobermans. Their bodies, their movements were of infinite beauty. Their eyes were serene, their hearts transparent, their smiles unruffled. And in the short-lived apotheosis, they saw gigantic palaces built from scratch. On leveled terrain, thousands of bonfires were lit. Millions of men came to sing the Messiah. On vast scaffolds, 10,000 brasses played Verdi's Requiem. Poems were picked out on mountainsides. Gardens sprang up in the desert. Whole towns were nothing but frescoes. But these glittering visions, all these visions which came surging and rushing towards them, which flowed in unstoppable bursts, these vertiginous images of speed, light, and triumph, seemed to them at first to be connected to each other in a surprisingly necessary sequence, in an unbounded harmony. It was as if before their bedazzled eyes a finished landscape had suddenly risen up, a total picture of the world, a coherent structure which they could at last grasp and decipher. At first it felt as if their sensations were multiplied by tens, as if their faculties of sight and sense had been amplified to infinite powers, as if a magical bliss accompanied their smallest gesture, kept in time with their steps, suffused their lives. The world was coming towards them. They were going towards the world. They would go on in discovering it. Their lives were love and ecstasy. Their passion knew no bounds. Their freedom was without constraint. But they were choking under the mass of detail. The visions blurred, became jumbles. They could retain only a few vague and muddled bits, tenuous, persistent, brainless, impoverished wisps. It was not a serene unity, but a brittle fragmentation, as if these visions had only ever been very distant and incalculably darkened reflections, illusory and elusive glimmerings fading away almost as soon as they were born, mere specks of dust, just the banal projection of their clumsiest desires, an almost insubstantial haze of paltry splendors, scraps of dreams they would never be able to grasp. They thought it was happiness they were inventing in their dreams. They thought their imagination was unshackled, splendid, and, with every successive wave, permeated the whole world. They thought that all they had to do was to walk for their stride to be a felicity. But what they were, when they came down to it, was alone, stationary, and a bit hollow. A gray and icy flatland, infertile tundra. There was no palace at the desert gate, no esplanade for their horizon. And from that desperate kind of quest, from that magical feeling of having for an instant almost been able to make it out, albeit dimly, from that extraordinary voyage, from that huge stationary conquest, from those new-found vistas and those pleasures foretold, from all that was not perhaps impossible beneath their imperfect dream and their admittedly awkward and hobbled impetus, which was none the less charged, perhaps to the point of impressionability. Part 2. 1. They tried to run away. You cannot live in a frenzy for very long. In a world which promised so much and delivered nothing, the tension was too great. They ran out of patience. They realized, one day, or so they thought, that they had to have a place to escape to. Their lives in Paris were treading water. They had stopped advancing. And on occasions they could see themselves, outdoing each other in the abundance of mistaken details characteristic of all their dreams, as 40-year-old petits bourgeois, with Jérôme running a team of hawkers, family protection, soap for the blind, students in need, and Sylvie keeping house, on a tidy little flat, with a small car, the same little family hotel where they would spend every holiday, and their television set. Or else, at the other extreme, which was far worse, as aging bohemians in polo necks and cord trousers, sitting every evening on the same café terrace in Saint-Germain or Montparnasse, scraping a living from occasional bargains and deals, misers to the tips of their dirty fingernails. They dreamed of living in the countryside, out of temptation's way. They would lead a calm and frugal life. They would have a white stone house on the edge of a village, warm elephant cord trousers, heavy shoes, anoraks, metal-tipped walking sticks and hats, and every day they would go for long walks in the forest. Then they would come back home, would make tea and toast, like the English do, put big logs on the hearth. They would play a quartet on the gramophone, which they would never tire of hearing, would read the great novels they had never had time to read, would have their friends to stay. Such flights of rural fancy were frequent, but rarely got to the point of being actual plans. On 2 or 3 occasions, to be fair, they did wonder what kinds of livelihood they might find in the country. There were none. The idea of becoming primary school teachers did occur to them once, but they found it immediately unappealing as they thought of cramped classrooms and days full of stress. They talked vaguely of becoming traveling booksellers, or of going off to an abandoned provinciale, Mass, to make rustic pottery. Then they indulged in imagining that they would live in Paris for just 3 days a week, earning enough to live on comfortably for the rest of their time, which they would spend in the department of Yonne or Laurier. But these embryonic departments never went very far. They never considered what was really possible, or rather really impossible, about them. They dreamed of giving up their jobs, letting go of everything, casting off on a new adventure. They dreamed of starting up again from scratch, of having another go, differently. They were dreaming of a clean break, of saying farewell. The idea, all the same, was working away and taking root inside them. By mid-September 1962, on their return from a gloomy holiday spoiled by rain and running short of money, they seemed to have made up their minds. An advertisement in Le Monde in the first days of October offered teaching jobs in Tunisia. It was not the ideal opportunity. They had dreamed of India, America, Mexico. It was an unglittering, down-to-earth offer, promising neither great fortune nor great adventure. They felt untempted, but they had a few friends in Tunis, old friends from school and college. And then there was the sun, the blue Mediterranean Sea, the promise of a different life, of a real departure, of a different kind of work. They agreed to apply. They were accepted. Real departures are prepared long in advance. This one was messy. It was more like running away. They spent a fortnight rushing from office to office for medical certificates, for passports, for visas, for tickets, for luggage. Then 4 days before they were due to leave, they learned that Sylvie, who had completed 2 years of her degree course, had been appointed to the technical college at Sfax, 170 miles from Tunis, whereas Jérôme, who had only a first-year pass by way of qualification, had been given a primary school job at Mehars, 23 miles in the other direction. It was bad news. They wanted to back out. Tunis, where accommodation had been booked for them, where they were expected, was where they had wanted to go, where they thought they were going. But it was too late. They had sublet their flat, booked their seats, given their farewell party. They had been getting ready to go for a long time. And then Sfax, of which they had barely heard the name before, was at the end of the world, a desert, and, with their pronounced inclination for extremes, they even began to take pleasure in thinking that they were going to be cut off from everything, remote from everything, isolated as they never had been before. However, they agreed that a primary school post was, if not too much of a slide, at least too heavy a burden. Jérôme succeeded in having his contract cancelled. One salary would be enough to live on until he could find some sort of work on the spot. And so they left. They were seen to the station, and on the morning of the 23rd of October, with 4 trunks full of books and a camp bed, they boarded the Commandant Crubelier at Marseille, bound for Tunis. The crossing was bad and the dinner was not good. They were seasick, took pills and slept soundly. In the morning, Tunisia was in sight. It was a fine day. They smiled to each other. They saw an island which they were told was called Ile Plaine, then great long and narrow beaches, and after they had passed La Goulette and entered the lake of Tunis, flocks of migrating birds. They were happy to have left. They felt they were emerging from a hell of crowded metro carriages, insufficient sleep, aching teeth, and uncertainty. Their minds were clouded. Their life had been only a kind of endless tightrope walk leading nowhere. Empty appetite, naked desire without bounds or props. They felt exhausted. They had left to go to ground, to forget, to wind down. The sun shone. The boat moved slowly, silently, along the narrow channel. On the road, quite close to them, people stood in open-topped cars and waved vigorously at them. In the sky there were little white clouds standing still. It was already hot. The panels beneath the handrail were warm to the touch. On the deck below them, sailors were stacking up deck chairs, rolling up the long tarpaulins which covered the holes. Queues lined up at the gangways for disembarkation. They got to Sfax 2 days later, towards 2 in the afternoon, after a 7-hour train journey. The heat was overpowering. Opposite the tiny white and pink station building, there lay an endless avenue grey with dust, lined with ugly palms and new-built blocks. A few minutes after the train had come in, after the sparse cars and bicycles had left, the town returned to a state of total silence. They left their cases in left luggage. They went down the avenue, which was called Avenue Bourguiba. After about 300 yards, they came upon a restaurant. A sizable wall-mounted adjustable ventilator hummed jerkily. On greasy tables with oilcloth tablecloths, a few dozen flies had congregated. A stubble-chinned waiter nonchalantly flicked them away with a napkin. For 200 francs they had a meal of tuna salad and veal cutlet. Then they looked for a hotel, booked a room, had their cases brought over. They washed their hands and faces, lay down for a moment, changed, and went back down. Sylvie went to the technical college. Jérôme waited outside on a bench. Towards 4 o'clock, Sfax began slowly to reawaken. Hundreds of children appeared, then veiled women, policemen dressed in grey poplin, beggars, carts, donkeys, spotless bourgeois. Sylvie emerged with her timetable in her hand. They carried on walking. They drank a can of beer and ate olives and salted almonds. Barkers were sailing the day before yesterday's Figaro. They had arrived. The next day Sylvie made the acquaintance of some of her new colleagues, who helped them find a flat. It consisted of 3 huge rooms with high ceilings and was absolutely bare. A long passageway led to a small square room from which 5 doors opened, 3 of them to the bedrooms, 1 to a bathroom, and 1 to a vast kitchen. 2 balconies looked out onto a small fishing harbour, South Channel, a dock which offered some resemblance to Saint-Tropez, and onto a foul-smelling lagoon. They took their first steps in the Arab quarter, bought a metal bedstead, 4 horse-haired mattresses, 2 cane chairs, 4 rope stools, 2 tables, a thick yellow raffia mat with sparse decorations in red. Then Sylvie began teaching. Day by day they settled in. Their trunks, which had been shipped as freight, arrived. They unpacked books, records, the record player, the trinkets. With large sheets of red, grey, and green blotting paper, they made lampshades. They bought long planks of barely planed wood and 12-hole bricks, and they covered 2/3 of the walls with bookshelves. On the walls they stuck dozens of reproductions, and on a prominently positioned wallboard they pinned photographs of all their friends. It was a cold and dismal dwelling, with its 2 high walls painted with a brownish sort of yellow distemper, which kept flaking off in large pieces, with its large, uniform, colourless tiles on all the floors. With its unusable volume, the flat was altogether too big and too bare for them to be able to live in it. There would have had to be 5 or 6 of them, a group of good friends, drinking, eating, talking. But they were on their own, and lost. The living room, containing the camp bed on which they had put a small mattress and a colourful bedspread, the thick raffia mat strewn with a few cushions, and above all, the books, the row of collected works in the Pléiade editions, the run of periodicals, the 4 Tisné volumes, the trinkets, the records, the large mariner's chart, the green parade, all the things which not so long ago had constituted the decor of their other life, all the things which took them back from this universe of sand and stone to Rue de Quatrefages, to the tree that stayed green for so long, to the little gardens. The living room, at least, still exuded a little warmth. Lying flat on the mat, with a tiny cup of Turkish coffee at their sides, they would listen to the Kreutzer Sonata, the Archduke, Death and the Maiden, and it was as though the music, which in this large and sparsely furnished room, almost as large as a hall, acquired stunning acoustics, came to inhabit it, and all of a sudden transformed it, like a guest, a very dear friend who had been lost sight of and found again by chance, coming to share their meal, talking to them of Paris. On a cool November evening in this foreign city where nothing was theirs, where they were ill at ease, music took them backwards, allowed them to recover an almost forgotten feeling of complicity and shared living, as if, inside a tiny island, within the boundaries of the mat, the 2 sets of shelving, the record player, the circle of light confined by the cylindrical lampshade, they had managed to establish and to preserve a protected area which time and space could not touch. But outside, all around, was exile and the unknown, the long passageway where footsteps echoed too loudly, the vast, icy, hostile bedroom with only a wide, too hard bed smelling of straw for furniture, and an unstable lamp on an old tea-chest, which stood as a bedside table, a wicker trunk full of dirty washing, a stool littered with clothes, and the 3rd room, not used, where they never went. Then the stone staircase, the main foyer, perpetually threatened by the sand, the street, 3 two-story blocks of flats, a shed where sponges were dried, and a plot of waste ground, the town around. In Sfax they spent what were probably the queerest 8 months of their lives. The port and the European quarter of Sfax had been destroyed during the war, and the city now consisted of about 30 streets set at right angles to each other. The 2 main streets were Avenue Bourguiba, running from the station to the central market, near where they lived, and Avenue Heidi Schocker, which ran from the port to the Arab quarter. The city centre was the intersection of these 2 streets. That was where the town hall was to be found, with 2 of its ground floor rooms containing a few ancient ceramics and half a dozen mosaics, as well as the statue and tomb of Heidi Schocker, murdered by the main rogue terrorists shortly before independence, the Café de Tunis, frequented by Arabs, and the Café de la Régence, frequented by Europeans, a little flower bed, a newsstand, and tobaccoists. Just over 15 minutes was enough to go right round the European quarter. From the building they lived in, the technical college was 3 minutes' walk away, the market was 2 minutes away, the restaurant where they ate all their meals was 5 minutes away, and the Café de la Régence took 6 minutes to reach, as did the bank, the municipal library, and 6 of the city's 7 cinemas. The post office, the station, and the higher point for cars to Tunis and Gabay were less than 10 minutes' walk, and constituted the outer limits of sufficient knowledge for living in Sfax. The Arab quarter, an ancient, beautiful, fortified city, displayed grey-brown walls and gates which were justifiably considered admirable. They often entered the Arab quarter, made it almost the only goal of all their walks, but because they were indeed only walking through, they remained forever strangers in it. They did not understand its basic mechanisms. All they could see was a labyrinth of alleys. Raising their eyes, they might admire a wrought iron balcony, a painted beam end, the pure ogive arch of a window, the subtle play of light and shade, an extremely narrow staircase. But their walks had no aim. They turned around on themselves, always afraid of getting lost, tiring easily. In the end there was nothing to attract them in this sequence of poverty-stricken stalls, of almost identical shops, of cramped bazaars, in this incomprehensible alternation of crowded and deserted streets, in this throng which did not seem to be going anywhere at all. Such feelings of foreignness grew all the more marked, became almost oppressive when, faced with long empty afternoons and desperate Sundays, they crossed right through the Arab quarter, and beyond Bab Debli got as far as the endless suburbs of Sfax. Stretching out for miles were tiny garden plots, hedges of prickly pear, wattle and daub houses, huts made of corrugated iron and cardboard boxes, and then huge abandoned and rotting pools, and, far away, at the vanishing point of the horizon, the first olive groves. They would loiter for hours on end. They would wander past barracks, cross waste ground and derelict quagmires. And when they returned to the European quarter, when they passed in front of the Halal or the Noor cinema, when they sat down at the Régence and clapped their hands to call the waiter, ordered a Coca-Cola or a can of beer, bought the latest issue of Le Monde, whistled for the hawker, dressed as always in his long, dirty, white smock and his canvas skullcap, to buy a few twists of peanuts, grilled almonds, pistachios, and pine nuts. Only then did they know that melancholy feeling that this was their home. They would walk beside palm trees grey with dust. They would pass along in front of the neo-Moorish facades of Avenue Bourguiba. They would cast vague glances at hideous window displays, flimsy furniture, wrought iron standard lamps, electric blankets, school exercise books, evening dress, ladies' shoes, bottled glass canisters. It was the only world they had, their real world. They dragged their feet on the way back. Jérôme would make coffee in zazuas made in Czechoslovakia. Sylvie corrected a pile of homework. To begin with, Jérôme had tried to find work. He went to Tunis several times, and, thanks to some letters of introduction he had written before leaving France, and to the contacts of his Tunisian friends, he met some functionaries at the Ministry of Information, in broadcasting, in tourism, and in the education service. It was a waste of time. Market research did not exist in Tunisia, nor did part-time jobs, and the few sinecures that existed were fully occupied. He had no qualifications. He was neither an engineer, nor an accountant, nor a draftsman, nor a doctor. He was again offered a teaching job. He wasn't keen. Very soon he gave up all hope. Sylvie's salary allowed them to live modestly. In Sfax, that was the commonest kind of living. Sylvie wore herself out trying to instill, as the syllabus required, the hidden beauties of Malherbe and Racine in pupils who were older than she was and didn't know how to write. Jérôme wasted his time. He started off on various projects, taking a diploma in sociology, sorting out his ideas about film, which he couldn't keep up. He wandered around the streets in his Weston shoes, strolled up and down the port, sauntered through the market. He went to the museum, exchanged a few words with the duty guard, spent a few minutes looking at an ancient amphora, a funeral inscription or a mosaic. Daniel in the lion's den. Amphitrite astride a dolphin. He went to watch a tennis match on the courts laid out beneath the ramparts. He walked through the Arab quarter, loitered in the bazaars, weighing up fabrics, copperware, saddles. He bought all the newspapers, did the crosswords, borrowed books from the library, wrote rather dismal letters to his friends, who often did not reply. Sylvie's job timetabled their lives. Their week was made of good days, Mondays because they had the morning off, and because the cinemas exchanged their films. Wednesdays because they had a free afternoon, and Fridays because they had the whole day off, and, once again, the films changed. And bad days, all the rest. Sunday was an intermediate day, pleasant in the morning. They would stay in bed, the Paris weeklies would come. Boring in the afternoon, gloomy in the evening, unless by chance there was a film to attract them. But it was not often that two notable, or even just watchable films were put on in the same half-week. And so the weeks passed. They followed each other with mechanical regularity. 4 weeks to a month, more or less. The months were all the same. The days, after getting shorter and shorter, began to get longer and longer. Their winter was wet, almost cold. Their lives were dripping away. Two. They were absolutely alone. Sfax was an inscrutable city. They felt, on occasions, that no one would ever find out how to pierce its mystery. Its doors would never open. There were people in the street, in the evenings, in self-contained crowds, people coming and going, an almost continuous tide of them under the awnings of Avenue Heidi Chacour, in front of the Mabrouk Hotel, the Destour Information Office, the Halal Cinema, the cake shop called Les Délices. There were public places, cafes, restaurants, cinemas, almost crammed with people, and faces which, now and again, might almost seem familiar. But all around, on the quayside, on the ramparts, as soon as you got away from the center, it was a void, it was dead. The huge, sand-strewn esplanade in front of Sfax's hideous cathedral, encircled by dwarf palms, Boulevard de Piqueville, lined by waste plots and two-story maisonettes, Rue Mégault, Rue Fizani, Rue Abdelkader, Zal, were bare, straight, and sand-swept. Sickly palm trees swayed before the wind. From their trunks, erupting in woody bracts, barely a handful of fronds emerged. A multitude of cats prowled amongst the dustbins. A yellow-coated dog sometimes scuttled past with its tail between its legs. Not a soul stirring. Behind ever-bolted doors, only bare passageways, stone stairs, windowless courtyards. Streets upon streets, set at right angles to each other, metal roller blinds, high wooden fences, a world of squares that were not squares, of non-streets, of phantom avenues. They would walk, not speaking, disoriented, and sometimes it seemed that everything was but an illusion, that Sfax did not exist, did not breathe. They sought signs of complicity all around. Nothing answered their call. They felt isolated in a way that was almost painful. They had been dispossessed. The world was no longer for swimming in, no longer in their arms, and never would be. It was as if, long ago and once and for all, an order had been made, a strict rule had been established to cut them out. They would be free to wander where they willed without let or hindrance, without anyone speaking to them. They would be forever incognito, forever strangers in the land. The Italians, the Maltese, and the Greeks in the port would watch them go by and stay silent. Olive oil entrepreneurs, in their all-white garb and gold-rimmed glasses, passing slowly on Rue de Bay with a beetle in their train, would walk straight past without seeing them. Sylvie's colleagues at work provided only distant and often standoffish relationships. French teachers with permanent posts did not seem to have unalloyed esteem for temporary staff. Even those who were not bothered by this distinction found it hard to forgive Sylvie for not being made in their own image. She should have been a teacher's wife as well as a career teacher herself, and a regular small-town, middle-class housewife, and have some dignity, deportment, culture. Not let the old country down, don't you know? And though there were, in a sense, two classes of expatriates, teachers at the start of their careers, eager to grab a suburban semi as fast as they could in Angoulême, Béziers, or Tarbes, and the cohort of conscientious objectors or disciplinary cases who did not get the colonial service bonus in their pay, but could afford to despise the first group. But the latter were a dying breed. Most objectors had been pardoned. Others were leaving to settle in Algeria or French Guinea. Neither class was prepared, apparently, to concede that you could sit in the cinema in the front row, next to native ragamuffins, or saunter unshaven, unbuttoned in the street, in clogs, like a ne'er-do-well. A few books were swapped, and a few records. There was the odd discussion at La Régence, and that was that. No warm hospitality, no keen friendship. That wasn't a plant that grew in Safax. People turned in on themselves, in their houses that were too big for them. With other groups, with the French staff at the Safax Gafsa Company, or the Compagnie des Pétroles, with Muslims, with Jews, with Pied Noir settlers, it was even worse. No contact at all was possible. Sometimes they would go for a whole week without speaking to anyone. It soon occurred to them that they were going to stop living altogether. Time passed and stood still. There was no longer anything to keep them in touch with the world, apart from eternally out-of-date newspapers which they began to suspect were well-meaning fabrications, or the memories of anterior life, shadows of another world. They had always lived in Safax. They would always live there. They had lost all their plans, all their impatience. They looked forward to nothing, not even to holidays too far over the horizon, not even to returning to France. They felt neither joy nor sadness, nor even boredom, but they did wonder sometimes if they still existed, if they really existed. They drew no special satisfaction from asking this deceptive question, beyond this. On occasions it seemed to them, in a muddled and murky way, that the life they were leading was appropriate, adequate, and, even paradoxically, necessary. They were in the center of a vacuum. They had settled into a no-man's land of parallel streets, yellow sand, inlets, and dusty palm trees, a world they did not understand, and they did not seek to understand, because, in their past lives, they had never equipped themselves to have to adapt, one day, to change, to mold themselves to a different kind of scenery, or climate, or style of living. Sylvie did not resemble, even for an instant, the teacher she was supposed to be, and Jérôme, as he traipsed down the street, could easily seem to have brought his homeland, or rather his quartier, his ghetto, his stamping ground, with him on the soles of his English shoes. But Rue l'Arbi-Zarouk, where they had built their nest, did not even have the mosque which ennobles Rue de Quatrefages. And as for the rest, despite their occasionally strenuous efforts to summon it all up in their imagination, Safax simply did not have a McMahon, or a Harry's Bar, or a Balzar, or a Contrescarpe, or a Pleyel, or Berge de la Seine une nuit de juin. In such a vacuum, precisely because of this vacuum, because of the absence of all things, because of such a fundamental vacuity, such a blank zone, a tabula rasa, they felt as if they were being cleansed, returning to a greater simplicity, to true modesty. And in a place as poor as Tunisia, to tell the truth, Their own financial straits, the petty poverty of civilized people accustomed to showers, cars, and cold drinks, did not mean very much. Sylvie took her classes, tested her pupils, marked her scripts. Jérôme went to the city library, read books at random, Borges, Troyat, Zarefa. They ate in a little restaurant, almost always at the same table. Tuna salad, veal cutlet, or a kebab, or lemon sole fruit. They went to La Régence for an espresso served with a glass of cold water. They read heaps of newspapers, saw films, loitered in the streets. Their life was like an unrelinquished habit, an almost unruffled tedium. A life sans everything. Free. From April they began to travel a little. On occasions when they had 3 or 4 days free and were not too short of money, they hired a car and drove towards the south. Alternatively, on Saturdays at 6 in the evening, a taxi bus would take them off to Susa or Tunis until Monday at noon. They tried to get away from Sfax, from its dreary streets and emptiness, so as to find vistas, sights and ruins which perhaps would dazzle or bowl them over, some glowing marvel which would even the score. The remains of a palace, or a temple, or an amphitheatre, a verdant oasis seen from a peak near Kai Ruin, a long strip of fine sand forming a curved beach as far as the eye could see, sometimes rewarded their search. But more often they escaped from Sfax only to find, a few dozen or a few hundred miles further on, identically dreary streets, identically incomprehensible and bustling bazaars, identical inlets and ugly palms, an identical desert. They saw Gabes, Tuzar, Nefta, Gafsa, and Metlawi, the ruins of Spetla, Kasserine, and Tel Tept. They passed through dead towers with names which had previously sounded to their ears like magic: Mahars, Mulers, Matmata, Medenin. They pushed on to the Libyan border. For miles and miles the land was stony, dusty, uninhabitable. Nothing grew, bar a few clumps of almost yellow, razor-sharp grass. They felt as if they had been driving for hours on end, in a pall of dust, along a road marked out only by old ruts or faded tire tracks, into a horizon of nothing but bumpy, dun-colored hills, without coming across anything at all apart from a dead donkey, a rusted jerry-can, a half-collapsed pile of stones which had perhaps been a house. Or else they would follow a sign-posted but potholed and occasionally almost dangerous road across enormous chats, and on every side, as far as the eye could see, there would be nothing but a whitish crust glaring in the sun and throwing up on the horizon sudden flashes which, now and then, seemed almost like mirages, the sea breaking, battlements. They would stop the car and walk a few steps. Beneath the crust of salt, lumps of dry and fissured light brown clay would sometimes collapse and expose blacker areas of compressed and spongy mud, which you risked sinking into, almost. Mangy camels entangled on their tethers as they ripped leaves off an oddly twisted tree with violent swipes of their heads and then jutted their stupid blubber lips out at the road. Distempered dogs, half wild, running round in circles. Shattered dry stone walls. Black long-haired goats. Low tents made of patchworks of pieces of blanket. These were the signs of an approaching village or town, consisting of a long line of rectangular, single-story houses with dirty white walls, a square minaret or a domed shrine. They overtook a peasant jogging alongside his donkey, and stopped at the Sol Hotel. 3 men squatting with their backs to the wall were eating bread dipped in oil. Children were running. A woman entirely draped in a black or purple veil, which covered her eyes as well, would sometimes be seen slipping from one house to another. The terraces of the 2 cafes spilled out a long way into the street. A tannoy broadcast Arab music, grating melodies played on rasping zithers, jangling timbrels, a flute playing a piercing dirge, refrains which were modulated, reprised, then done in unison, da capo, 100 times over. Men sitting in the shade, drinking tea in small glasses, played dominoes. They went past huge water tanks along a poorly made track and came upon the ruins. 4 pillars 20 feet tall with nothing to support anymore. Wrecked buildings whose ground plan had been preserved by the imprints of the earth, of the floor tiling in each room, by isolated steps, cellars, paved streets, remnants of sewers. And people claiming to be the guides offered to sell them little silver fish, shiny coins, terracotta figurines. Then, before leaving, they would go to the market, into the bazaar. They would get lost in the labyrinth of arcades, dead ends, and passageways. A donkey would be burdened with 2 conical hampers of plaited rope, brimful of ground pimento. In the jeweler's souk, in the textile souk, tradesmen sitting cross-legged, unshod, on a pile of blankets, would roll out piled carpets and fustian in front of them, offer them red woolen burnouses, hakes of wool and silk, leather saddles embroidered with silver thread, beaten brass trays, fretwork boxes, guns, musical instruments, small jewels, scarves with gold thread drawn through, and parchments adorned with bold arabesques. They bought nothing, obviously to some degree because they did not know how to buy and were worried about having to haggle, but above all because they did not feel drawn to these things. None of them, however lavish they could occasionally be, gave them a feeling of wealth. They moved on, amused or indifferent, but all they saw remained foreign, belonged to another world, did not concern them. And from these trips they brought back only images of emptiness and drought, desolate heaths, tundra, sea inlets, a mineral world where nothing grows, their own world of loneliness, their own dry desert. It was in Tunisia, all the same, that one day they saw the house of their dreams, the most beautiful dwelling imaginable. It was the house, at Hammamet, of an aging English couple who divided their time between Tunisia and Florence, and for whom hospitality seemed to have become their only recourse against dying from mutual boredom. There were at least a dozen other house guests at the same time as Jérôme and Sylvie. The atmosphere was one of futility, often to the point of exasperation. Parlor games, bridge, and canasta took turns in between somewhat snooty conversations, in which not entirely outdated gossip, coming direct from the capitals of Europe, gave rise to informed and often firm-minded judgments. I like the man very much, and what he's doing is quite right. But the house was paradise on earth. Set in the midst of a great park sloping gently down to a fine sandy beach, it was an old building in the local idiom, not particularly large, all on one level, which had grown year by year and become the sun of the whole constellation of pavilions of all sizes, of arbours, shrines, and bungalows with verandas on all 4 sides, dotted around the estate and connected to each other by lattice-walled walkways. There was an octagonal room with no openings other than a small door and 2 narrow slit windows, with its thick walls entirely lined with books, which was as shady and cool as a tomb. There were tiny rooms, whitewashed like monastic cells, with only 2 Saharan armchairs and a low table to furnish them. Other rooms were long, low, and narrow, with walls hung with thick mats, and yet others furnished in English country style, with ingle nooks and massive fireplaces flanked by a pair of settees facing each other. In the grounds, white marble-paved paths meandered amongst the lemon trees, the orange trees, and the almonds, lined with fragments of antique pillars. There were brooks and waterfalls, grottos and ponds covered with large white water-lilies between which you could sometimes see the silvery streak of fish. Peacocks paraded, uncaged, just as they had dreamed. Bowers overgrown with roses led to lush hideaways. But it was probably too late. The 3 days they spent at Hammamet did not shake off their torpor. For them it was as if all this luxury and comfort, this profusion of things offered with their immediately obvious beauty, concerned them no longer. In times past they would have gone to hell to have the hand-painted tiles they saw in the bathroom, for the fountains in the grounds, for the tartan carpet in the main hall, for the library's oak panelling, for the china, the vases, the rugs. They acknowledged them as memories. They had not become insensitive to them, but they no longer understood them. All their landmarks were missing. That was certainly the Tunisia they would have found it easiest to settle in, cosmopolitan Tunisia with its remnants of prestige, pleasant climate, and its colorful and picturesque life. That was certainly the kind of life they had first dreamed of, but they had turned into Sfaxians, provincials, exiles. A world without memories, without memory. More time passed, days and weeks of desert waste, which did not count. They had stopped wanting, an indifferent world. Trains came, ships docked, unloaded machine tools, medicines, ball bearings, took on phosphates and olive oil. Lorries loaded with straw crossed the town on their way to the south, where there was famine. Their life went on identically, teaching, espressos at La Régence, old films in the evening, newspapers, crosswords. They were walking in their sleep. They no longer knew what they wanted. They were dispossessed. It now seemed to them that before, in each day, that before receded further into the past, as if their interior life was falling slowly into the domain of legend, of the unreal, or of the shapeless. Before, they had had at least a passion for possessing. Often it was wanting that had been all their existence. They had felt drawn towards the future, impatient, consumed with desire. And then what? What had they done? What had happened? Something resembling a quiet and very gentle tragedy was entering the heart of their decelerating lives. They were adrift in the rubble of a very ancient dream, lost amidst unrecognizable ruins. There was nothing left. They were at the finishing line, at the terminus of the doubtful trajectory which had been their life for 6 years, at the end of that uncertain quest which had taken them nowhere, which had taught them nothing. Epilogue. Things could have carried on in the same way. They could have stayed like that all their lives. Jérôme would have got a job for himself. They would not have been short of money. They would have got transferred to Tunis eventually. They would have made new friends. They would have bought themselves a car. At La Marsa, or Sidi Bou Said, or El Manza, they would have had a fine detached house, a big garden. But it will not be easy for them to escape from their own story. Time once again will work in their stead. The school year will come to an end. It will turn deliriously hot. Jérôme will spend his days on the beach, and Sylvie will come to join him when her classes are over. There will be the last scripts to mark. They will feel holidays coming on. Then they will pine for Paris, for spring on the banks of the Seine, for their tree all in flower, for the Champs-Élysées, for Place des Vosges. Their eyes will water as they reminisce over their dearly cherished freedom, their lazy mornings, their candlelit dinners. And friends will send them their holiday plans, a big house in Touraine, good food, outings in the country. What if we went back? One of them will say. It could all be just like it used to be, the other will answer. They will pack. They will sort the books, the prints, the snapshots of their friends. They will throw away huge quantities of paperwork, give away their furniture, their poorly planed planks, their 12-hole bricks, and ship their trunks. They will count the days, the hours, the minutes. Their last hours in Sfax will be spent on a solemn repetition of their ritual walk. They will cross the central market, pass by the port for a bit, admire as they do every day the huge natural sponges drying in the sun, go past the Italian delicatessen, the Hotel des Oliviers, past the city library, and then, turning back on themselves down Avenue Bourguibia, they will skirt the hideous cathedral and fork off at the collège, where for the last time they will nod, as they nod every day, to Monsieur Michery, the chief caretaker, who will be plodding up and down in front of the gates, and then go along Rue Victor Hugo, take one last look at their regular restaurant, at the Greek church. Then they will enter the Arab quarter by the Kasbah gate, take Rue Bab Jadid, then Rue de Bay, emerging by the Bab Dewan gate to reach the awnings of Avenue Heidi Shaker, and then on past the theatre, the 2 cinemas, the bank, before drinking their last cup of coffee at La Régence, buying their last cigarettes, their last newspaper. 2 minutes later they will take their seats in a hired Peugeot 403 about to depart. Their cases will have been roped to the roof rack long before. They will clutch their wallets to their chests, their boarding passes, their rail tickets, their luggage receipts. The car will move off slowly. At 5:30 of a summer's evening, Sfax will be a truly beautiful city. Its pristine buildings will glisten in the sunlight. The towers and crenellated ramparts of the Arab quarter will rise up in pride. Boy Scouts all dressed up in red and white will march by in step. Tunisian flags, a white crescent on a red ground, and the green and red ensign of Algeria will wave in the breeze. There will be a bit of the sea, so blue, and then big building sites, interminable suburbs jammed with donkeys, children, and bicycles. Then the endless olive groves. And then the open road. Sakiet Zit, El Jem and its amphitheater, Masakin, the city of brigands, Susa and its overpopulated seafront, and Fidaville and its huge olive plantations, Bir Bu Rakba and its coffee shops, fruit and ceramics, Grambalia, Potenville and its vine-covered hills, Haman Leaf, then a stretch of motorway, industrial suburbs, soap factories, cement works, Tunis. They will spend hours swimming at Carthage, amidst the ruins, at La Marsa. They will go all the way to Utica, to Selabia, to Nabule, where they will buy a juglet, to Goleta, where, late in the evening, they will eat amazing bream. Then one day at 6 in the morning they will be at the docks. Embarkation procedures will be long and tiresome. They will struggle to find a place on deck to pitch their chairs. The crossing will be uneventful. At Marseille they will drink a bowl of café au lait with croissants. They will buy yesterday's Le Monde and Libération. On the train they will hear the wheels beating out the bars of songs of victory, of the Hallelujah chorus, of triumphant hymns. They will count the kilometers. They will be in raptures over the French countryside, its great wheat fields, its great green forests, its pastures and gentle rolling hills. They will get in at 11 in the evening. All their friends will be at the station. They will be amazed at how well they look. They will be as tanned as trekkers, and wearing broad-brimmed hats of plaited straw. They will tell all about Sfax, deserts, splendid ruins, how cheaply you can live there, the sea so blue. They will be dragged off to go to Harry's. They will get drunk straight away. They will be happy. And so they will return, and it will be even worse. Rue de Quatre-Fêges will still be there, with its wonderful tree, in their little flat, so quaint, with its low ceiling, with its one red-curtained window and its one green-curtained window, its good old books, its heaps of newspapers, its narrow bed, its tiny kitchen, its mess. They will see Paris again, and it will be all that life can afford. They will saunter by the banks of the Seine, in the gardens of Palais Royal, in the side streets of Saint-Germain. And every night, in the brightly lit streets, every shop window will once again be a wondrous enticement. Stalls will groan with the weight of foodstuffs. They will join in the shoving throng in department stores. They will thrust their hands into folds of silk, cup their hands around chunky phials of perfume, brush their hands over ties. They will try to live as they lived before. They will pick up their old contacts in the agencies. But the spells will have broken. Once again they will suffocate. They will think they are dying from things being too small, too cramped. They will dream of fortune. They will look in the gutters in the hope of coming across a bulging wallet, a banknote, a franc, a metro ticket. They will dream of getting away to the country. They will dream of Sfax. They won't stick it out for long. And so one day, how would they not always known that this day would come? They will decide to be done with it, once and for all, like everyone else. Their friends in the know will look out for jobs for them. A good word will be put in at several agencies. Full of hope, they will write carefully pondered curricula vitae. Their luck, but it will not be luck exactly, will be in. Their employment records, despite being irregular, will be given particular scrutiny. They will be summoned. They will manage to find the words that are needed to make a good impression. That is how, after a few years of errant living, weary of not having enough money, weary of counting the pennies and of resenting the counting, Jérôme and Sylvie will accept, perhaps with thanks, to an executive post accompanied by salaries which could just about pass for a golden hello which some big shot will offer them in advertising. They will go to Bordeaux to take over an agency. They will prepare their departure with care. They will sort out their flat, have it repainted, get rid of the piles of books, the bundles of linen, the stacks of crockery that had always cluttered it up, and beneath which they had often felt they were suffocating. They will walk around their almost unrecognizable two-room apartment, which they had always said it was impossible to do anything in, especially to walk round. They will see it for the first time the way they had always wanted to see it, at last repainted, sparkling white and clean, without a speck of dust, unstained, without a crack in the plaster or a tear in the wallpaper, with its low ceiling, its rustic courtyard, its admirable tree over which, very soon, just as they had in the past, the new owners will fall into raptures. They will sell their books to dealers and their old rugs to second-hand clothes shops. They will do the round of tailor, dressmaker, shirtmaker. They will pack their trunks. They will not really earn a fortune. They will not be chairmen or managing directors. The only millions they will manipulate will belong to other people. They will get some of the crumbs, for appearances, for silk shirts, for pigskin gloves. They will be presentable. They will be well housed, well fed, well dressed. They will not be wanting. They will have their Chesterfield settee, their armchairs in soft natural leather as stylish as seats in Italian racing cars, their rustic tables, their lecterns, and their fitted carpets, silk rugs, and light oak bookcases. They will have huge empty rooms full of light, plenty of clearance, glass panels, magnificent outlook. They will have china, silver cutlery, lace napkins, sumptuous red leather bindings. They will not yet be 30. They will have their whole lives ahead of them. They will leave Paris early one September. They will be in an almost empty first-class carriage. The train will pick up speed almost straight away. The aluminum carriage will sway comfortingly. They will leave. They will leave everything behind them. They will run. Nothing could have held them. "Do you remember?" Jérôme will say, and they will muse on time past, dark days, youth, their first relationships, their first surveys, the tree in the courtyard in Rue de Quatrefages, the friends they had lost, the comradely dinner parties. They will recall how they could cross Paris to look for cigarettes, and stop in front of antique dealers. They will summon up memories of their days in Safax, their slow death, their almost triumphant return. "So here we are," Sylvie will say, and it will seem to them to be almost a matter of course. They will feel at ease in their lightweight clothes. They will spread themselves out in the deserted carriage. The French countryside will march past them. They will look in silence on the great fields of ripe wheat, the burnt rigging of the high-tension pylons. They will see glassworks, almost spanking new factories, large holiday camps, dams, small houses all alone in clearings. Children will be running away along a white road. The journey will be pleasant for a long while. Towards noon they will wander nonchalantly down to the dining car. They will sit by a window, facing each other. They will order 2 whiskies. They will look at each other one last time with a smile of complicity. The starched table linen, the solid cutlery engraved with arms of the Compagnie des Wagons Lits, the weighty, emblazoned crockery will seem like a prelude to a sumptuous feast. But the meal they will be served will be quite simply tasteless.